The room is quiet, so quiet that you can almost hear the dust drifting down through the air, settling on the wooden table where a single book lies open. The faint glow of a candle trembles against the walls, its shadow stretching and recoiling, as though afraid of the very words inked upon those fragile pages. The book is old, older than memory, older than the empires that once swore they would last forever. Its spine cracks faintly as the page turns, and in that small sound one begins to wonder, what knowledge could possibly demand such secrecy, such fragility, such reverence? What truth is so unbearable that centuries have conspired not merely to forget it, but to bury it deliberately, as though burying a body? This is where our story begins, not in the clamor of war, nor in the grandeur of palaces, but in silence. For silence has always been the greatest ally of forbidden ideas. They are not slain by fire, they are not banished by decree. Instead, they are quietly smothered, as if too much attention would risk their survival. And yet, paradoxically, it is this very silence that makes them echo even louder through history. We must ask ourselves then, what is the most dangerous thing a human can think? Not the forging of a weapon, that is mere steel and steel rusts. Not the raising of an empire, that is only stone and stone crumbles. No, the most dangerous thing a human can think is an idea, because an idea has no edges to blunt, no walls to topple, no armies to disband. An idea can leap across centuries, whisper from forgotten ruins, and stir to life in the quiet hours when one sits alone with thought. It cannot be chained, for it lives within the mind. It cannot be burned, for fire cannot consume what is not material. It cannot be killed, for even in death it lingers in the memory of others. And history tells us that the powerful have always feared such things. Kings feared them because ideas erode obedience. Priests feared them because ideas test dogma. Governments feared them because ideas destabilize control. And yet, for all this fear, ideas persisted. Some were written into secret texts, bound in leather, hidden in monasteries under candlelight. Others were whispered between travelers at roadside inns, shared not as doctrine but as rumor, fragments of something half-believed but wholly dangerous. Some were taught in codes disguised as poetry, concealed in parables, and some survived only in silence, carried not in words, but in the heavy knowledge that something existed beyond what had been permitted. The story of the world is not only the story of wars and kings, it is also the story of thought. It is the tale of ideas that unsettled the ground beneath civilizations. Consider for a moment the image of the ancient library. Halls lined with scrolls and codices, filled with the collective wisdom of generations. And yet, for all their grandeur, these libraries were fragile. Fire consumed them, floods rotted them, and more often than not, human hands decided which works would remain and which would be erased. We imagine knowledge lost to chance, but in truth, much was lost by choice. Ideas deemed too dangerous were locked away, redacted or condemned. Some were copied only in fragments, surviving like bones, leaving us to guess what creature they once belonged to. And why? Because there are thoughts that do not serve authority. Thoughts that suggest the world could be different, that power is an illusion, that gods may not be as they are told, that death is not the end, or worse, that life may have no higher design. Such thoughts are not comfortable. They cannot be easily contained in sermons or law codes. They demand too much, unsettle too deeply. So they were not destroyed, for destruction makes martyrs. Instead, they were buried. Buried carefully, intentionally, with the hope that obscurity would accomplish what censorship could not. Imagine then the monasteries of the Middle Ages. Scribes hunched over parchment, their quills scratching long into the night. They copied scripture, philosophy, and history, but they also made choices, what to keep, what to alter, what to omit. A line erased here, a passage glossed over there. Dangerous words were sometimes struck through with ink so heavy it left a scar in the vellum. Entire manuscripts disappeared into vaults, sealed not with locks, but with silence. Some monasteries chained their most volatile books to the walls, not to protect them from thieves, but to protect the world from them. Because there are words, it was believed, that should never be allowed to roam freely. Or think of secret societies where flickering candlelight illuminated faces intent upon whispers. Men and women gathered in hidden chambers, exchanging fragments of knowledge forbidden in the outside world. They spoke in codes, cloaked their ideas in symbols, and disguised their truths in rituals. Why? Because an idea carried openly was dangerous. It could invite exile, punishment, even death. And yet for all this risk they gathered anyway, because for some the pursuit of truth was worth more than obedience. And so, across the centuries, the pattern repeats. An idea arises, it unsettles, it spreads, and then it is buried. And yet it survives, sometimes fractured, sometimes distorted, sometimes hidden in unexpected places. But always it lingers, always it waits. Which brings us back to our central question. What then is the most dangerous idea ever conceived by a human being? What could be so powerful that it drew the fear of kings and the suspicion of priests, that it was buried in libraries and hidden in whispers, that it has outlasted empires and yet still remains veiled? We will not rush to the answer, for part of its danger lies in the journey itself. To reveal it too quickly would strip it of its gravity. Instead, we will trace the path of dangerous ideas through time, through ancient philosophy, through forbidden science, through political heresies, through metaphysical doubts. We will see how they rose, how they spread, and how they were smothered. And in each age we will ask what made this idea unbearable, why could it not be allowed to live in the open air, and why, despite all efforts, did it never truly die? The tone we will carry is not of urgency nor of fear, but of quiet reflection. For though these ideas were once weapons against authority, to us they are stories. Stories that remind us of the fragility of truth, of the power of thought, and of the strange resilience of human curiosity. We will wander calmly through history's shadows unhurried, as one might walk through a dimly lit gallery, pausing before each fragment, each inscription, each echo of the forbidden. Picture, if you will, the ruins of an ancient city. Stones, broken, columns fallen, yet fragments of pottery and inscriptions remain scattered in the dust. To walk among them is to sense that something once thrived here, something vibrant, something alive. Dangerous ideas are much the same. Their monuments may be broken, their names forgotten, but their fragments remain. They whisper from the edges of history, inviting us to listen, to wonder, to piece together what was meant to be forgotten. And so, dear listener, as the candlelight flickers and the shadows deepen, let us begin our journey. Not with a proclamation, but with a question. Not with an answer, but with a whisper. What is the most dangerous idea humanity ever dared to conceive? And why was it buried, not destroyed? The pages lie before us, the fragments wait to be uncovered. All we must do is turn the first page, listen carefully, and step quietly into the long night of hidden thought. In the beginning there was darkness, not the soft darkness of a quiet room, but the vast and untamed darkness of a world unshaped, unmastered, and unclaimed. For the earliest humans, this darkness was not just absence, it was threat. Night meant predators. Night meant cold. Night meant the silence of the unknown pressing against the fragile boundaries of human life. And then, into that vast silence, came a flicker, a spark, a flame. A fragile miracle that hissed, danced, and glowed against the blackness. Fire. It is tempting to see fire simply as a tool, as warmth against the cold, light against the night, protection against the beasts. And yes, it was these things. But fire was more than utility. Fire was the first dangerous idea, for fire is transformation made visible. It takes what is solid and reduces it to ash. It takes what is lifeless and makes it blaze with heat and light. It is power that can nurture, but also destroy. It is control over nature itself, the ability to bend an element of the cosmos to human will. And in that moment, when humankind first cupped fire in trembling hands, they held not just a flame, but a metaphor for every idea to come. Because ideas, like fire, begin small. They flicker in a single mind, fragile and uncertain. They can be smothered quickly if stamped upon in their infancy, but if nurtured, if given kindling, if given breath, they spread, they grow, They leap from one person to another, igniting communities, transforming cultures. And like fire, they do not recognize boundaries. They burn where they will, indifferent to the intentions of those who first sparked them. Early humans sensed this dual nature of fire instinctively. To carry flame was to carry danger. A campfire could protect against wolves, but a wildfire could erase an entire valley. The same flame that roasted meat could also consume the shelter that housed a family. It was a gift, but a perilous one. And so, from the very beginning, humanity learned that power must be watched, guarded, perhaps even hidden. The first lesson of fire was the lesson that would echo through millennia. Not all sparks should be allowed to spread. This awareness found its way into the oldest stories. Consider the myth of Prometheus. In Greek legend, Prometheus defied the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humankind. For this act of defiance, he was punished endlessly, bound to a rock while an eagle devoured his liver day after day. It is a tale not merely of theft, but of transgression, of a boundary crossed. The gods withheld fire for a reason. The myth implies to give it to mortals was to disrupt the balance, to hand over a tool too dangerous, too transformative. The punishment of Prometheus was not about fire alone. It was about the consequences of unleashing power that could not be contained. And Prometheus is not alone. In myth after myth, across cultures and continents, we find warnings against curiosity, against the quest for forbidden knowledge. Pandora, opening her jar and unleashing chaos upon the world. Adam and Eve tasting the fruit of knowledge and being cast from paradise. The serpent whispering that there is more than what is permitted. Again and again the lesson repeats. Curiosity comes with a price. To seek, to discover, to light a spark, is to invite both wonder and ruin. These myths are not just stories of the distant past. They are echoes of a deep, almost instinctive fear that there exist truths too dangerous for the human mind, ideas too volatile for the human world. They reveal that from the dawn of history, societies recognize the double edge of knowledge. To know is to gain power, but also to risk destruction. And so, even as fire transformed the human story, it was never trusted completely. Tribes and villages learned to guard their flames, to shield them from strangers, to pass them carefully from one generation to the next. A fire could be stolen, and in being stolen, power shifted. To hold the spark was to hold the future. It was not merely survival, it was dominance. Whoever commanded fire commanded the night, commanded the beasts, commanded the boundaries of life itself. And so fire became the first contested idea, the first hidden power, the first knowledge whose possession marked the difference between the weak and the strong. From here, the metaphor only grows. For what fire was to the body, ideas would become to the mind. They warmed, illuminated, and transformed, but they also burned, scarred, and destroyed. And just as early humans built rituals around fire, treating it with reverence, feeding it with offerings, encircling it with stone, so too would later societies build rituals around ideas, guarding them with doctrines, chaining them with dogma, protecting them from misuse. Fire and thought are cousins. Both are sparks that resist containment. Both are forces that demand reverence. Both remind us that control is always temporary, that suppression is always fragile. But notice something important. In every myth, the spark cannot be returned. Prometheus cannot undo his theft. Pandora cannot close the jar. Adam and Eve cannot untaste the fruit. Once fire is given, it is given forever. Once an idea has been thought, it cannot be unthought. It may be buried, it may be hidden, but it exists. It lingers, waiting for someone else to uncover it, to ignite it once more. This is the curse of dangerous ideas. They are immortal. And so, when we speak of the most dangerous idea humanity ever conceived, we must remember that it was not born in a library, nor in a temple, nor in a philosopher's parchment. Its lineage begins here, with the firelight flickering in the darkness, with the myths that warned of its peril, with the instinctive awareness that some sparks change everything. Think of the first time someone carried fire across a darkened plain, cupped carefully against the wind. In that moment, they were more than human. They were a vessel of transformation. The fire did not belong to them, not truly, but they carried it, and in carrying it they bore responsibility. In the same way, each dangerous idea in history has found its carrier, an individual, a philosopher, a dissident, a dreamer, who dared to hold it in trembling hands. And like fire, the idea was not theirs to own. It belonged to no one, and yet it consumed everything it touched. This is why early civilizations were wary. They understood that sparks spread. And so, knowledge was often guarded. Not every secret was shared, not every truth written down. The Egyptians hid their mysteries in temples, restricting them to priests. The Mesopotamians carved laws in stone, but kept their cosmologies cloaked in ritual. The Greeks told myths to remind people of boundaries not to be crossed. To seek too much, too quickly, was to risk setting the world aflame. And yet, despite all warnings, curiosity never ceased. Sparks always leapt. Myths could caution, but they could not extinguish the impulse to wonder, to probe, to discover. And so, across time, humanity learned the same lesson again and again. Every gift of knowledge carries within it a shadow. Every light casts a darkness. Every flame bears the risk of becoming a firestorm. As we move forward in this story, we will see that the struggle has never changed. Each age discovers its own Prometheus, its own Pandora, its own spark that should not have been lit. And each age responds the same way, first with fear, then with suppression, then with silence. For the guardians of power have always known that the most effective way to contain an idea is not to destroy it, but to bury it, to let it lie smoldering beneath the ashes, forgotten, until someone dares to dig it out again. And that is where our path leads. From the fire of the ancient world to the forbidden scrolls of forgotten libraries, from myths whispered by poets to truths hidden in monasteries, from the sparks of science to the whispers of philosophy. Each is a flame that should have been, contained, but was not. Each is a reminder that the human mind is drawn irresistibly to the forbidden, to the dangerous, to the spark that burns even as it illuminates. And so the story of dangerous ideas begins not with a book, not with a word, but with a flame. The first light against the first night, the first spark in the first darkness, the first dangerous idea. Close your eyes and imagine silence so deep it hums. Not the silence of a library or a sleeping village, but something far more unsettling, the silence before sound itself, before form, before even the thought of being. Imagine a space with no walls, no ground, no sky, a place where there is not even place. That is the shape of nothing, or perhaps more accurately, its unshape. Humanity has always feared this silence, this absence, this void. For what is more terrifying to the mind than the possibility that everything, our lives, our worlds, our gods, might rise from nothing and to nothing return? The idea of nothingness is one of the most dangerous ideas ever conceived. Dangerous not because it wields a sword or commands an army, but because it unravels meaning itself. If nothing can exist, then everything we build, our kingdoms, our religions, our hierarchies, rests on a fragile stage that could, in theory, vanish. To gaze into nothing is to admit the possibility that we ourselves are temporary flames burning in a darkness that neither begins nor ends. The earliest civilizations resisted the void. They peopled the cosmos with gods, spirits, and stories, not merely out of imagination but out of defense. The Babylonians spoke of primordial waters, not empty space. The Egyptians imagined none, the endless sea of potential, but never called it nothing. The Hebrews declared, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." There was never nothing, not truly, because God himself was always. The void, if it existed, was banished by creation's first word, "Let there be light." But human minds are restless. And in the quiet corners of Greece, India, and China, thinkers dared to imagine what others would not. They asked, what if nothing is not absence, but truth? In Greece, the philosopher Parmenides, around the 5th century BCE, declared that non-being could not exist. Nothing, he argued, was impossible to think about, because the moment you thought it, it became something. To think of nothing is to give it shape, and therefore it ceases to be nothing. But in his denial he exposed the paradox, that nothing has a strange, haunting reality. You cannot touch it, yet it touches thought itself. His student Zeno, famous for his paradoxes, also wrestled with infinity, divisibility, and the gaps between being and non-being. What lay in the spaces between? The Greeks could not stop circling the void, as if it were a fire too bright to stare at directly. Yet others went further. Democritus and Leucippus, fathers of atomism, spoke of the universe as composed of indivisible particles moving in the void. Here it was, the dangerous admission that emptiness was not an illusion but a structure. Atoms could not dance without a stage, and that stage was nothingness. This was revolutionary because it meant the world was not the fabric of gods or the breath of divine order, but matter floating in emptiness. And if the world is nothing more than atoms in the void, then where exactly is the throne of Zeus? Where is the altar of the king? Where is the guarantee of eternal meaning? The priests, of course, resisted. To speak of nothing was to weaken. The authority of something divine, something holy, something enthroned. For power rests on certainty, and nothing undermines certainty more quickly than the thought that behind all ceremony and splendor lies absence. Meanwhile, across the oceans in India, thinkers of the Vedic and Buddhist traditions were arriving at their own radical conclusions. The Upanishads whispered of shunyata, emptiness, the pregnant void from which all forms arise and into which they dissolve. In Buddhism, especially as it evolved under Nagarjuna centuries later, emptiness was not terror but truth. To cling to permanence is illusion, they taught. To see the world as empty is to glimpse liberation. But such teachings were no less dangerous, for if everything is impermanent, if all forms are void, then where does that leave kings who claim divine mandate? Where does that leave priests who claim their rituals sustain the cosmos? Our doctrine of emptiness undermines not just metaphysics, but politics. In China, Taoist sages approached the question differently. Laozi spoke of the Tao as the great source, the void that gives birth to being. 30 spokes share the wheels. Hub. It is the empty space that makes it useful. Here nothing is utility, a paradoxical fullness. Zhuangzi told stories where absence was as real as presence, where the void was the condition for freedom. Such ideas were deeply subversive, for they suggested that rulers, palaces, armies, all solidity, were illusions compared to the deeper power of the void. Notice the pattern. Across civilizations, the idea of nothing recurred, like a whisper, that could not be fully silenced. Yet always it was met with unease, because if nothing is something, then what is God? What is creation? What is the point of power or prayer or sacrifice? To embrace nothing is to strip the universe bare, leaving us with questions too vast for comfort. Even in mathematics, nothing proved dangerous. The number 0, so obvious to us now, was once forbidden, even feared. The Babylonians, masters of numbers, had no 0. The Greeks, so proud of geometry, avoided it. How could you write a symbol for what does not exist? To give nothing a number was to invite the void into the temple of knowledge. It was in India, again, that 0 was born, a hollow circle, a mark of absence that was also presence. By the 7th century, mathematicians like Brahmagupta began to treat 0 not as a mistake but as a number in its own right. This was radical. With 0 came negative numbers, infinities, the very structure of modern mathematics. And with mathematics came power, astronomy, engineering, navigation, the ability to predict and control the world. But priests resisted, kings resisted. For to grant nothing a place on the number line was to admit that emptiness could hold as much weight as being. When 0 finally traveled westward, through Arabic scholars to medieval Europe, it was met with suspicion. Some Christian thinkers called it the mark of the void, a symbol that smacked of heresy. How could nothing be something? To trust. 0 was to trust the abyss. And yet merchants adopted it eagerly, for it made calculation easier. Bankers embraced it, for it allowed debt, absence, negative value to be accounted. Thus the void slipped into society through ledgers and markets, smuggled in by necessity, even as theologians frowned. The danger of nothing, then, was not only abstract but practical. A king could not tax nothing, a priest could not bless nothing, and yet zero began to erode old certainties, to open new worlds. From it came algebra, calculus, the mathematics of motion and infinity. Without zero, there would be no computers, no modern science, no exploration of the stars. The most frightening emptiness of all turned out to be the foundation of progress. But beneath this triumph lies unease. Because the void does not comfort. It never did. To say that everything comes from nothing is to strip the sacred from the stage. It is to admit that the universe may be indifferent, that our lives may be brief flares against infinite dark. Even now, the void unsettles. Astrophysicists speak of vacuum energy, the possibility that empty space seethes with invisible force. Cosmologists wonder whether the universe itself emerged from a quantum fluctuation, a bubble in nothing. If so, then our existence is not divine design, nor cosmic inevitability, but accident. The echo of that first dangerous idea lingers, whispering through science as it once whispered through philosophy. Perhaps nothing is the deepest truth. And here lies the peril. For societies are built on meaning. To believe in nothing too fully is to risk nihilism, despair, collapse. It is one thing to teach emptiness as a path to enlightenment, another to allow it to seep into the foundations of law, morality, or empire. And so rulers resisted, priests resisted, nothing was buried. Under ritual, hidden under metaphor, softened by story. But it never disappeared. You cannot erase nothing, instead it waits. In the silence between words, in the gap between numbers, in the pause before thought. It is there, haunting the margins of philosophy, mathematics, and spirituality. Sometimes it comforts, sometimes it terrifies, but always it undermines. For if nothing is possible, then everything is fragile. If zero holds value, then value itself is precarious. If emptiness is truth, then all fullness is fleeting. This is why the idea of nothing belongs among the most dangerous sparks humanity ever conceived. Not because it tells us how to rule or how to fight, but because it whispers that ruling and fighting may be shadows in the void, that we too are shadows, that beneath the monuments and scriptures and empires, beneath the calendars and ledgers and prayers, lies only silence. And yet perhaps that silence is not end but beginning. Perhaps nothing is not negation but possibility, for from the void came stars, from emptiness came words, from zero came numbers that build our age. This paradox, the void as danger, the void as foundation, is what makes the idea so haunting. It is not simply terrifying, it is indispensable. To deny it is to live in illusion, to accept it is to risk despair. And so the story of nothing is not finished. It echoes in science, in theology, in art. It whispers in questions we dare not ask too loudly. If nothing is the ground of everything, then what is the worth of our crowns, our scriptures, ourselves? Perhaps the most subversive thought of all is not that we are small, but that we are suspended over an abyss that cannot be denied. And with that whisper, we step deeper into the labyrinth of forbidden ideas. For nothing was only the beginning. Beyond it lie other truths, other sparks, other flames too dangerous to be left in the open. And like fire, like zero, they have never gone out. They wait, buried, patient, until the moment comes to burn again. The story of humanity has always been tethered to the horizons it dares to imagine. For early civilizations, the horizon was both comfort and terror. It marked the edge of what was known, and beyond it lay darkness, monsters, or perhaps nothing at all. The sky curved above, the seas stretched outward, but for most of human history, maps were not instruments of exploration. They were boundaries of control. To draw a map was not only to chart land and water, but to assert power, to define what was permitted as real. And yet there were always whispers that the lines drawn by kings and priests were not the true borders of the world. There were sailors who returned with stories of coastlines unseen, stars that guided them beyond known waters, and traders who claimed they had traveled further than the empire dared to admit. These whispers were sparks, and like all sparks, they were dangerous. The idea that the earth was larger than what authority proclaimed was never a simple matter of curiosity. To challenge the edges of the world was to challenge the edges of power itself. Ancient rulers understood that geography was more than dirt and water. It was ideology. If you controlled the map, you controlled people's imagination of what was possible. And so maps were guarded as jealously as treasures, with forbidden versions destroyed and alternative visions suppressed. A map, after all, was more than a picture. It was a promise or a warning. In Mesopotamia, the oldest known maps carved onto clay tablets portrayed the earth as a flat disk encircled by cosmic waters. This was not merely a belief, it was an order imposed by priests. The gods, they taught, had fashioned the world as a finite, safe cradle for humankind. To question the map was to question the gods, and to question the gods was to question the priests who claimed to speak for them. And so, to say that the earth might extend endlessly beyond the known rivers and mountains was not only blasphemy, it was rebellion. Dangerous maps, drawn by travelers who claimed to have seen lands beyond the sea, were often destroyed. If a fisherman swore he had seen islands rising out of the mist, his testimony was treated as drunken folly. If a sailor dared to chart them, his parchment might be confiscated, his reputation ruined, his name buried. Yet the human heart has never been content with boundaries. The Greeks, with their restless curiosity, began to push at the edges. Thinkers like Anaximander imagined that the earth floated freely in space, a radical departure from the flat earth myths. Pythagoras whispered of a spherical world, a shape both perfect and infinite, reflecting the geometry of the cosmos. Such ideas were thrilling, but also perilous. For if the earth was round, then it had no true edge, and if it had no edge, then it could not be easily contained within the neat order of kings and gods. To imagine a world without borders was to imagine a humanity less tethered to authority. It was to suggest that perhaps power could be challenged, because the universe itself was larger than the cage built around it. The story of maps and power continued in Rome. Empire itself was an act of mapping, the red lines of conquest drawn across continents. The Romans declared their empire eternal, stretching to the ends of the earth. But when soldiers stumbled upon tribes, rivers, or deserts that lay beyond the limits of Roman maps, a subtle danger arose. The empire was not the world. There was more, and the idea that there was more was enough to inspire both fear and longing. Rome's control depended upon the illusion of finality. To admit there was a world beyond Rome was to admit Rome was not everything. Thus, maps became propaganda, drawn not for accuracy but for dominance. To suggest otherwise, to claim there were hidden lands beyond the empire, was to undermine the mythology of imperial eternity. The Middle Ages deepened this tension. For centuries in Europe, maps became theological documents rather than geographical ones. The famous Mappa Mundi depicted Jerusalem at the center, the holy axis of the earth, with monstrous races and perilous oceans at the edges. These maps were not meant to guide sailors. They were sermons in ink, reminders of divine order. The Church declared that to travel too far from the known world was to risk one's soul. To suggest otherwise, that one could sail west and find land or chart a path to the east not ordained by Scripture, was to question God's authority. And so, alternative maps, drawn by restless travelers or compiled from traders' tales, were quietly hidden. Some were destroyed outright. Others survived only in secret collections tucked away by scholars who knew their implications could not be spoken aloud. But sailors are not bound by parchment. On the decks of creaking ships, guided by the stars, mariners often discovered truths long before scholars dared to admit them. They knew of currents that carried vessels beyond supposed edges, of islands unmarked by official maps, of coastlines that stretched further than the Church acknowledged. And yet, these men often found themselves silenced. A sailor who claimed too loudly to have seen lands across the Western Sea risked not only ridicule but punishment. For if people believed him, then the authority of priests and kings would fracture. And so many kept their secrets, telling their stories only in whispers over ale, or scratching faint maps in the margins of personal journals. It is no coincidence that myths grew where maps refused to go. Tales of sea monsters, whirlpools, and edges where ships would tumble into nothingness were more than superstition. They were tools of control. They served as warnings. Do not sail too far. Do not think beyond what is given. Do not question the lines that have been drawn for you. But the very existence of these myths reveals the hunger people felt. If no one had been tempted to sail further, there would have been no need for such terrifying stories. Fear was a leash, and maps were the hand that held it. The danger of forbidden maps was not limited to Europe. In the Islamic Golden Age, cartographers like Al-Idrisi created breathtakingly accurate world maps, incorporating knowledge from Africa, Asia, and beyond. Yet even here, maps were entangled with politics. To chart the world too fully was to acknowledge other powers, other truths, other centers of civilization. And so, some maps were deliberately altered, their proportions stretched, or their details omitted, not out of ignorance, but out of caution. A ruler who admitted the world was vast also admitted his own smallness, and so the safest course was often silence. The story echoes again in China, where emperors declared their realm the Middle Kingdom, the center of the universe. Maps were drawn to reinforce this vision, showing China as the axis of the world, with other lands diminished or absent entirely. To draw a map, suggesting otherwise that the world was larger, that China was but one part of a greater whole, would have been treasonous. And yet traders and explorers knew the truth. They traveled along the Silk Road, they sailed across seas, they saw lands beyond the emperor's gaze. Their maps, when they existed, were rarely shared openly. They survived only in fragments passed hand to hand like secret letters. What is striking across all these stories is not only the suppression of dangerous maps, but the persistence of the idea itself. No matter how fiercely kings burned parchments or priests denounced explorers, the knowledge did not vanish. It lingered, carried in stories, songs, and whispered rumors. It lived in the starlight calculations of sailors, in the strange goods brought by traders, in the quiet certainty of those who had seen more than they were allowed to describe. And when the age of exploration finally burst forth, it was not a sudden revolution, but the slow culmination of centuries of forbidden whispers. When Christopher Columbus set sail westward, he did not sail into the unknown. He sailed into the forbidden. He carried maps and charts that drew upon centuries of secret knowledge accumulated despite suppression. And when he returned, the world cracked open, not because it had suddenly become larger, but because the dangerous idea could no longer be contained. The earth was not bound by myth. It was vast, and if the world was vast, then so too were the possibilities for human ambition, imagination, and rebellion. The danger of the map beyond the world was never simply about geography. It was about imagination. To admit the world was bigger than the rulers claimed was to admit that truth could exist beyond authority, that knowledge could escape control, that human beings could dream beyond the cages built for them. And once people realized this about the world, they began to wonder, what else was larger than they had been told? Was the soul more expansive than doctrine allowed? Was society more equal than hierarchy claimed? Was the mind itself unbounded by the chains of tradition? Maps were never just about land. They were about the limits of thought. And so the map beyond the world was not only a piece of parchment, but a symbol, that there is always more, that the horizon is never final, that the lines drawn for us are not the end of the story. The section closes by shifting the focus from geography to humanity itself. If maps taught us that the world is larger than rulers claimed, what happens when the same realization is applied to human worth? What if the boundaries drawn between king and subject, priest and peasant, master and slave are just as false as the edges of ancient maps? What if equality itself is the next dangerous idea, an idea more threatening than any uncharted sea? And so, with the sound of waves still echoing, the narrative drifts toward its next revelation, that just as the world extended beyond its allowed limits, so too did the human spirit, daring to believe that all men and women might stand equal beneath the endless sky. If there is one idea more dangerous than the suggestion that the earth is larger than the rulers allowed, it is the suggestion that the soul itself is larger than they allowed. Empires, kingdoms, priesthoods, and dynasties all depend upon a certain structure, that some are born high and others are born low, that some are closer to the divine while others serve in silence beneath them. But from the earliest days of human thought, there flickered a different vision, one as fragile as it was profound. It whispered that within every human being, slave or emperor, man or woman, rich or poor, there is something immeasurable, something equal, a soul. And if the soul is equal, then all the hierarchies of the world tremble. This was not a political idea first. It was not born from ballots, assemblies, or constitutions. It was born in temples, in caves, in circles of seekers, in the quiet breath of prayer. Spirituality, for all its tendency to be used as a tool of control, has always carried within it a hidden current of rebellion. Long before people demanded equality in law, some dared to imagine equality before the divine. That imagination was incendiary. It suggested that kings and priests were not intermediaries between humanity and heaven, but that every heart had its own direct line to the infinite. The Stoics of ancient Greece and Rome held such a vision. They taught that reason, the spark of divine fire, burned equally in all human beings. Whether one wore a crown or chains, the same fire lived within. A slave like Epictetus could teach emperors because his soul was no less vast. In the Stoic vision, the dignity of the soul was universal, unshaken by circumstance. To live according to this truth was to live in freedom, even in captivity, and yet in a society that thrived on slavery and hierarchy. This vision could never be fully embraced. It was tolerated perhaps as philosophy, but if ever it moved from thought into practice, it would have been revolutionary. In India, centuries earlier, the teachings of the Buddha had sounded a similar note. He rejected the rigid hierarchies of caste, the divisions that had for centuries separated the noble from the untouchable. In his teachings, suffering was shared, impermanence was shared, and the path to awakening was open to all. To sit in meditation was not a privilege of kings, but a possibility for anyone with breath in their lungs. The Sangha, the community of practitioners, was meant as a radical experiment, a gathering where birth and wealth mattered less than the shared work of liberation. This too was a dangerous thought, so dangerous that over time societies bent it back into hierarchies, reinscribing rules of rank and authority even within the folds of robes. But the seed remained. The soul, however defined, was not a privilege of the few. In early Christianity, the whisper grew louder still. In the letters of Paul, we find a sentence that rang like thunder. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one. To the ears of Roman power, this was not a metaphor. It was a provocation. If all were one, then slavery was a lie. If all were one, then the divinity of emperors was a fraud. If all were one, then the very structure of Roman society was an edifice, built on sand. Small communities of early Christians took these words seriously, gathering not as hierarchies but as circles, where the poor broke bread alongside the wealthy, where women spoke and prophesied, where slaves were baptized beside their masters. These gatherings were fragile, often crushed, often forced into hiding, but they carried within them an unbearable truth, that the soul does not bow. The danger of the equal soul was that it could not be contained by boundaries of time or place. Again and again in different lands, under different skies, it appeared. Among the Sufis of the Islamic tradition, the poets sang of a divine love that annihilated distinctions. Rumi's verses remind us that we are all one under one sky, and that to look into another's eyes is to glimpse the infinite. Such visions were intoxicating but also perilous, for if love erases hierarchy, then sultans and caliphs lose their crowns and clerics lose their authority. And so many mystics were celebrated in poetry, yet persecuted in life, their teachings tolerated only when safely contained within metaphor. The equal soul was always a whisper, rarely a shout. When it grew too loud, rulers moved to silence it. In societies built upon slavery, the idea was intolerable. If every soul bore the same dignity, then no man had the right to own another. In societies built upon kingship, it was dangerous. If the soul of a peasant was equal to the soul of a monarch, then what was the justification for crowns? In societies built upon divine hierarchies, it was heretical. If every soul had equal access to the sacred, then what need was there for intermediaries, priests, or rituals sold at a price? And yet, despite persecution, the whisper survived. It survived because it spoke to something people already felt, deep within. Every slave who sang, every peasant who prayed, every outcast who dreamed, felt that within them there was a worth that could not be stolen, a light that could not be extinguished. They may not have had the words of philosophy or theology, but they carried the truth in their bones. I am no less than another. The weight of this truth was unbearable to those in power, and so history is filled with the ways it was buried. Churches grew into hierarchies, with bishops and popes standing in the place of emperors. Castes returned in new forms, cloaked in laws or customs. Monarchs claimed divine right, insisting that their souls were somehow different, somehow chosen. But beneath all these structures, the whisper went on, refusing to die. Mystics carried it, martyrs carried it, poets carried it, and eventually, ordinary men and women carried it into the streets. The emotional power of this idea lies in its simplicity. It does not argue, it declares. It does not require proof, it resonates. When a mother holds her child, she knows without teaching that the life in her arms is sacred. When a man watches his friend die in chains, he knows without doctrine that something cruel has been committed against a dignity too deep to name. The equal soul is not an invention, it is a recognition as ancient as breath, but recognition is not acceptance. For most of history, this idea remained underground, like a river flowing beneath the soil. It nourished, but in secret. Only rarely did it break to the surface, and when it did, the world shook. It surfaced in the voices of prophets, crying against injustice. It surfaced in rebellions when the oppressed rose not only for food but for dignity. It surfaced in revolutions when people declared that the divine spark in them was no less than in the kings who ruled over them. The transition from whisper to revolution was not quick, nor was it inevitable. It came slowly, painfully, carried forward by those willing to suffer for it. Each tradition, each century, added a note to the song. The Stoics gave the language of reason, the Buddhists gave the vision of shared suffering, the Christians gave the cry of oneness, the Sufis gave the fire of love. Together, these voices created a chorus that could not remain buried forever. And so, by the time the modern world emerged, the idea of equality was no longer only spiritual. It had become political. The equal soul became the equal citizen. The dignity of the person became the foundation of rights, laws, and revolutions. The whisper that once risked heresy became the declaration that all men are created equal. But even then, the path was not smooth. The world has continued to resist the idea, to betray it, to twist it. And yet, the fact that it continues to reappear again and again shows its resilience. What makes this idea so heavy, so emotionally overwhelming, is that it is both true and unfulfilled. We feel it as a promise, yet see it denied in practice. We know it as a light, yet watch it covered by shadow. Every age has betrayed it, and yet every age has carried it forward. The equal soul is humanity's greatest truth and greatest burden. It demands that we see each other without illusion, without hierarchy, without cruelty. It demands that we recognize ourselves in the eyes of the stranger, the enemy, the forgotten. It demands that we live as if dignity is not a prize but a birthright. This demand is what makes it revolutionary. For once the equal soul is recognized, no structure of power can remain untouched. Kings become men, masters become thieves, priests become fellow seekers. The walls that divide crumble not in an instant, but inevitably. And when they crumble, something larger emerges, not just a new order, but a new possibility for what it means to be human. This section ends with the weight of that possibility. The equal soul was once only a whisper in temples and caves, but now it has become a thunder heard across nations. The whisper of mystics has turned into the cries of crowds. The prayer of slaves has become the demand of citizens. And just as the map beyond the world shattered the false edges of geography, the equal soul shattered the false edges of humanity itself. From here, the story cannot help but move into revolution. For once equality is recognized in the soul, it must eventually be demanded in the streets. And so, the narrative flows forward, from the dangerous whisper of the equal soul to the dangerous fire of human revolution. There is a kind of silence that rulers love, the silence of vanished voices. A speaker can be killed, a teacher silenced, a prophet erased from memory, but writing makes silence impossible. Once a word is written, it outlives the breath of its speaker. Once ink touches parchment, once a stylus scratches into clay, the voice becomes immortal. The body may perish, but the sentence remains hidden in a scroll, buried in a jar, smuggled across borders in the lining of a coat. Writing is humanity's most dangerous weapon, for it does not rely on memory alone. It does not depend on a single voice repeating itself endlessly. It endures, it waits, and when the time is right, it speaks again. From the beginning, rulers understood this danger. To control writing was to control the future. To allow forbidden words to spread was to risk rebellion, heresy, even the collapse of entire empires. And so again and again, across centuries and continents, the written word was both a weapon and a crime. To write what was not permitted was to endanger one's life. To preserve what had been forbidden was to commit an act of resistance. In ancient China, the Qin dynasty sought to erase the past by fire. The Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who dreamed of a rule eternal as the mountains, decreed that all books not sanctioned by the state should be destroyed. In 213 BCE, scholars were commanded to surrender their texts, histories, philosophies, records of rival traditions. Anything that did not serve the empire's official story was condemned to flame. Entire libraries burned, their knowledge turned to ash that drifted over the capital. Those who resisted paid with their lives. According to legend, hundreds of scholars were buried alive for refusing to surrender forbidden works. And yet some texts survived, hidden in walls, buried underground, carried in secret by those who believed memory was too fragile a vessel. The Qin Empire eventually fell, but the written words it sought to destroy lived on, surviving its fire, its walls, and its silence. The written word endures not only through survival, but through rediscovery. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer stumbled upon a clay jar buried in the desert. Inside were leather-bound codices, sealed for nearly 1,600 years. When scholars opened them, they found the lost voices of early Christianity, the so-called Gnostic Gospels. These texts spoke of visions and mysteries, of secret teachings attributed to Christ and his followers. They told a different story than the one canonized by bishops and emperors. In their pages, salvation was not obedience, but awakening. The divine was not far away, but within. These ideas had once been declared heretical, their teachers hunted, their books burned. But in that jar they had waited, silent and patient, until a time when they could be read again. When the pages were turned, it was as if forgotten voices were whispering across centuries, their words fragile but unbroken. Such discoveries remind us that writing is a kind of time travel. A voice from centuries ago, once hidden or suppressed, can suddenly step into the present. The Dead Sea Scrolls, uncovered in caves near Qumran, carried fragments of a world that had been erased. Scribes, fearing conquest and destruction, sealed their texts in jars and left them in the desert. For nearly 2,000 years the scrolls slept. Then a shepherd boy, searching for a lost goat, threw a stone into a cave and heard the shattering of pottery. Inside, the words of prophets, psalms, and apocalyptic visions were preserved. What had been forbidden or forgotten returned, as if no empire could truly silence them. Every civilization has its own story of forbidden texts. In medieval Europe, manuscripts that questioned church authority were chained shut, banned, or burned. The Cathars of southern France, whose teachings challenged Catholic doctrine, had their books destroyed in the flames of the Inquisition. Spain, during the conquest of the Americas, Mayan codices, records of centuries of astronomical observation, ritual, and history, were fed into fire by missionaries who saw only heresy. In 1562, in the city of Mani, a single friar presided over the burning of nearly every Maya book. Only a handful of codices survived the flames. The loss was immeasurable, an entire memory, an entire vision of the cosmos turned to smoke. And, yet even in destruction, the act of burning acknowledged a truth, that writing had power. It was dangerous because it endured. The hushed truth is this: every forbidden book carries within it a kind of sacred weight. Not sacred because of ritual or blessing, but sacred because of defiance. To write what should not be written is to stand against silence itself. To preserve such words is to refuse the erasure of history. To read them is to awaken the dead. In the flicker of candlelight, turning the fragile pages of a text that once might have cost a life, we feel the presence of those who risked everything to ensure the words survived. But writing is not only resistance, it is also contagion. Words once written spread like seeds. A single manuscript can be copied, hidden, smuggled, translated. Ideas once confined to a single voice can cross borders and centuries. The heretical texts hidden in jars, the outlawed poems whispered from memory, the banned pamphlets printed in secret presses, all of them are fragments of this contagion. It is why every empire has feared the written word, and why every empire has tried and failed to erase it. Consider the invention of the printing press. Suddenly, forbidden texts could be multiplied faster than they could be burned. Martin Luther's theses, nailed to a church door in 1517, would have been a local quarrel, except that printers carried them across Europe. Within weeks, what should have been a single protest had become a storm. Authority understood too late. Writing could no longer be contained. Once words were on the page, they belonged not to the rulers but to the readers. The page itself became a battlefield. There is something cinematic in imagining these secret survivals. A monk in candlelight, copying a manuscript forbidden by his order. A scholar in ancient China rolling a scroll and hiding it beneath the floorboards. A desert hermit, sealing gospels in a clay jar, whispering a prayer that someday, someone, would find them. Across centuries, across languages, the scene repeats. Always the same urgency, the same fear, the same quiet hope, that the words will outlast the silence. And they do. The most dangerous texts in history are not the ones that survive easily, but the ones that survive barely. The fragile scrap of papyrus, the charred fragment of a codex, the smuggled pamphlet. It is in their survival that we see their power. For the words that no one tried to burn are the ones that never threatened the world. The words that were feared, censored, outlawed, those are the ones that carried fire. Writing, then, is a secret pact with time. It says to the present, you may erase me, but I will return. It says to the ruler, you may kill the speaker, but you cannot kill the voice. It says to the reader, here across centuries I am speaking to you as if no time has passed at all. And in that moment, when the reader meets the writer across the abyss of years, power trembles. For in that meeting the dead live again, the silenced speak again, and the forbidden becomes undeniable. The transition from writing to science is natural, almost inevitable. For what is science but the written memory of observation? Without writing, discoveries would vanish with their discoverers, and knowledge would die each generation. With writing, knowledge compounds layer upon layer until it reshapes the world. The dangerous power of the written secret, once confined to heresy and rebellion, becomes the foundation of astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Writing makes not only memory eternal, but knowledge cumulative. What begins as a whisper in candlelight becomes the thunder of revolutions in thought. And so in the quiet turning of a page, we stand at the threshold. Behind us lie the forbidden texts, the whispers preserved in jars and ashes. Ahead of us lies another danger, the danger of knowledge itself. For if writing could outlast kings, then science, built upon writing, could outlast the very boundaries of belief. The equal soul had shaken the thrones of men. The written word had shaken the control of priests and emperors, and now science, fueled by writing, multiplied by memory, would shake the very order of the universe. There is a deep comfort in believing the world revolves around you. To stand on the solid ground of earth and look upward at the stars is to feel central, to feel necessary. For millennia, humanity built its stories on this foundation, that the Heavens turned in circles above us, that the sun and moon obeyed our horizon, that the earth itself was the axis of creation. Religions told us so. Kings told us so. Philosophers repeated it with solemn certainty. The universe was a stage, and humanity stood at its center. But truth has a way of unraveling comfort, and sometimes the most dangerous truth of all is not the one that reveals monsters or miracles. It is the one that reveals our smallness. Long before the names Copernicus and Galileo became immortal, the suspicion had already begun. In ancient Greece, thinkers like Aristarchus of Samos dared to imagine that the earth was not the center, but rather a wandering body circling the sun. His vision was breathtaking, terrifying, and quickly ignored. For what did it mean if the earth was not central? What did it mean if humanity was not the axis of all creation, but only one orbit among many? Such ideas whispered of irrelevance. They suggested that the grand stories of divine order might be flawed, and so Aristarchus's vision faded, surviving only in fragments of memory. Centuries later, in the medieval world, knowledge lived under watchful guardians. The heavens were mapped not only by astronomers but by priests. To chart the stars was to confirm the cosmic order decreed by God. The great spheres, transparent and perfect, were imagined as carrying the planets like jewels across the night sky. The earth, motionless, lay in the center of it all. Around, it revolved the sun, the moon, and the planets, all contained within crystalline orbs. Beyond these spheres lay heaven itself, radiant and eternal. This model was not merely science, it was theology, politics, and identity woven into one. To question it was to tug at the very fabric of society. And yet, in the quiet of his study, a Polish canon named Nicholas Copernicus began to doubt. He had read the old fragments of Aristarchus. He had watched the irregularities in the sky, the strange backward dances of Mars, the awkward adjustments required to keep the Earth-centered model intact. What if, Copernicus wondered, the Earth was not central at all? What if the sun, steady and blazing, was the true anchor, and the Earth a traveler in orbit? For years he kept his thoughts close. To declare them openly was unthinkable. He drafted his ideas, refined his numbers, whispered his suspicions to trusted friends. His masterpiece, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, was not published until the year of his death in 1543. It was as though he could only release the truth once he himself was beyond danger. In its pages lay the simple, devastating claim: the earth moves. The sun does not orbit us, we orbit it. To read these words was to feel the ground shift beneath one's feet. If Copernicus was right, then the universe was not built for us. The heavens did not move around our tiny stage. We were not central but peripheral, not the fixed point but one among countless wanderers. It was a truth that carried awe but also dread. At first, the response was muted. Copernicus wrote in the dense language of scholars, and his book circulated, slowly. But the idea took root, and once an idea is planted, it grows. By the time Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the heavens in the early 17th century, the suspicion had become undeniable. The telescope was itself a dangerous invention, a tube of glass that extended human vision into forbidden realms. Through it, Galileo saw what no human had seen before: mountains and craters on the moon, proving it was not the smooth, divine sphere described by Aristotle. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, tiny worlds moving not around the Earth, but around another planet. He saw the phases of Venus, evidence that only made sense if Venus circled the sun. Each observation chipped away at the old model, each glimpse through the lens striking a blow against the comfortable fiction of a geocentric universe. Galileo did not remain silent. He wrote, he argued, he proclaimed. With a voice as clear as his telescope's lens, he told the world that Copernicus had been right. The earth moved. The sun was central. The heavens were not as the ancients had said. But to proclaim this truth was to challenge not just astronomy, but authority itself. The Church, which had long guarded the cosmic order, saw the danger at once. If the earth was not central, then perhaps humanity was not central. If humanity was not central, then perhaps the scriptures were not literal maps of the universe. And if the scriptures could be questioned in this, what else could be questioned? The hierarchy trembled. Faith, politics, and order were all bound to the idea of Earth's primacy. To say otherwise was to invite collapse. Galileo was summoned before the Inquisition. The grand halls of power weighed not his telescope, but his words. He was commanded to recant, to silence the dangerous truth. Under threat of imprisonment and worse, he muttered the words of submission. Yet legend tells us that as he rose from the trial, he whispered under his breath, "E pur si muove." And yet, it moves. That whisper has become one of history's most haunting lines. In it lies the whole terror and triumph of forbidden knowledge. The world may silence the speaker, but the truth moves on. The earth, indifferent to decrees, continues its orbit. The heavens move, no matter what words are spoken in courts or pulpits. The awe of this realization is immense. To step into the Copernican vision is to see the night sky anew, not as a dome circling us, but as an endless ocean in which we drift. The dread is equally immense. We are no longer the axis of creation, but a speck, a wanderer on a minor planet circling a modest star. The human story shrinks in cosmic scale. And yet in that shrinking, a new kind of grandeur emerges, the grandeur of truth itself, vast and unyielding. The idea that the heavens move is dangerous precisely because it dissolves human centrality. It whispers that the universe is not designed for our comfort. It suggests that truth does not bend to our pride. Once accepted, it leads inevitably to further questions. If the earth is not central, then perhaps our kingdom is not eternal. If the stars are not fixed, then perhaps our politics are not divinely ordained. The telescope opened not only the sky, but the possibility that authority itself might be wrong. And so, from Copernicus and Galileo onward, the struggle between truth and power intensified. Scientists pushed deeper, mapping the orbits of planets, describing the laws of motion, measuring the invisible pull of gravity. With each discovery, humanity's pride eroded further. We were not at the center. We were not unique. We were not even stable. The heavens themselves moved, and with them the foundation of belief trembled. There is quiet dread in standing beneath the stars now, knowing what Copernicus and Galileo dared to say. We are wanderers on a turning earth, circling a star that itself circles the galaxy, which itself drifts through the cosmos. The heavens are not fixed. They are rivers of motion, endless and indifferent. In that vastness, our empires are brief, sparks, our creeds, small whispers. And yet the very act of knowing this is an achievement beyond empires and creeds. For to face smallness with clear eyes is its own kind of courage. This courage has always frightened rulers. Knowledge, once unchained, cannot be caged again. The church could silence Galileo, but it could not erase the telescope. Kings could ban books, but they could not stop the stars from moving. And so the idea that the heavens move did not end in astronomy. It flowed outward into politics, philosophy, and revolution. If the cosmos could be questioned, so could the crown. If the universe was not as priests declared, then perhaps society was not as kings decreed. The dangerous idea of the moving heavens was only the beginning. Its true threat lay not in planets and stars, but in the precedent it set. That truth, once discovered, cannot be made to orbit power, and this realization would soon spill from the heavens onto the earth itself, where knowledge would challenge politics, just as it had challenged theology. For much of human history, power was imagined as something that descended from above. Kings ruled by divine right. Emperors claimed the mandate of heaven. Pharaohs carried the blood of gods. Authority was not negotiated, but inherited, decreed, imposed. The people, the ordinary masses who tilled fields, carried burdens, and filled armies, were never meant to speak. Their role was to obey. To imagine otherwise was more than disobedience. It was heresy. And yet, across centuries and continents, a dangerous murmur echoed beneath the grand palaces and thrones. It was the whisper that power might flow not from the heavens downward, but from the earth upward, from the people themselves. This whisper was democracy, and it frightened rulers, more than invading armies, more than famines, more than death itself. Because if the people believed their collective voice mattered, the foundations of monarchy, empire, and hierarchy would crack like thin ice. The story of democracy does not begin as triumph, but as a fragile experiment. In the rocky soil of Athens in the 5th century BCE, something improbable occurred. Common citizens gathered to decide the fate of their city. They voted on laws, debated policy, and judged leaders. Power, for the first time, was treated not as a sacred inheritance, but as a shared responsibility. Of course, this democracy was imperfect. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. But for the men who gathered in the Athenian assembly, it was a revelation. Their voices carried weight. The polis was not owned by a king, it was theirs. This experiment shook the ancient world. To those who ruled elsewhere, Persian monarchs, Macedonian conquerors, Roman patricians, the idea of self-governance seemed absurd, even dangerous. A people without a master was a people without order, they claimed. And indeed, democracy in Athens was fragile. It survived wars, demagogues, and betrayals, but eventually it was strangled by empire, absorbed into the expanding power of Rome. Rome itself flirted with republican ideas, balancing power between senators and magistrates. But even there, the people's voice was carefully contained. True democracy was treated with suspicion, something unstable, something that needed to be managed and restrained. And when Caesar declared himself dictator for life, the illusion cracked. The republic fell into empire, and with it the people's voice was smothered beneath imperial grandeur. For centuries afterward, monarchy and empire would cloak themselves in inevitability. Rule by the many was dismissed as chaos. Order, rulers insisted, required the guiding hand of the few. Yet the idea refused to die. Across ages and continents, the whisper returned. In medieval towns, guilds and communes demanded charters to govern themselves. In villages, peasants gathered to decide how to share fields, when to plant, when to harvest. These small acts of self-rule were sparks in the darkness, often extinguished by kings, but never forgotten. For every suppression, memory endured. By the Enlightenment, the dangerous whisper grew into a roar. Philosophers dared to say openly what had once been unthinkable, that sovereignty belongs to the people. Thinkers like John Locke argued that rulers derived authority only from the consent of the governed. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote of the general will, the collective voice that surpassed any monarch's decree. These were not abstract musings, they were incendiary claims. To kings and queens they were dynamite hidden in books, because if people began to believe such words, palaces would fall. And fall they did. In 1776, in the New World, colonists raised a declaration not of loyalty, but of independence. Governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed, they proclaimed, a sentence so dangerous it echoed like cannon fire across continents. The American Revolution was not merely a war for territory, it was an experiment in the forbidden idea that common people could build a government for themselves. Not long after, in France, the whisper became a shout that toppled a throne. In 1789, crowds stormed the Bastille, declaring that sovereignty belonged not to a king but to the nation. The guillotine became the terrible symbol of a world turned upside down, where rulers who once imagined themselves untouchable could be dragged into the streets by the voice of the people. To Europe's monarchies, the French Revolution was a nightmare, proof that the collective will could shatter centuries of divine order. But the road of democracy was never smooth. Every advance was met with resistance. Kings crushed uprisings, empires censored books, dictators manipulated elections. Even in nations that claimed democracy, the voice of the people was narrowed by exclusions. Women silenced, the poor restricted, minorities suppressed. Each expansion of the vote, each recognition of equality, was wrestled from those in power like a weapon seized from clenched hands. The 19th century carried the struggle forward. Revolutions swept across Europe in 1848, demanding constitutions, assemblies, rights. Some gains were won, many were lost, but the idea spread like wildfire. In the Americas, former colonies forged republics. In Asia and Africa, movements for self-determination stirred beneath imperial rule. Everywhere the same dangerous thought pulsed: Why should the many be ruled by the few? By the 20th century, democracy had become both promise and battlefield. World wars were fought in the name of freedom, even as dictators rose who silenced the people's voice with terror. Fascism and communism, though different in form, shared a common dread of uncontrolled democracy. Both claimed to speak for the people while crushing dissent. And yet beneath the boots of tyranny, the whisper endured. When the Berlin Wall fell, when apartheid collapsed, when colonies declared independence, it was the same ancient murmur. Finding breath again, the people's voice cannot be silenced forever. The danger of democracy lies not in chaos, as kings once claimed, but in its relentless challenge to power. To grant the people a voice is to accept that rulers may be questioned, judged, even dismissed. It is to admit that authority is not eternal but conditional. For those who clutch power tightly, this is terrifying. And so even in modern times, democracy is contested. Ballots are manipulated, voices are suppressed, propaganda drowns out truth. The struggle between rulers and the ruled continues, reshaped, but unending. And yet, for all its fragility, democracy endures. The collective voice has an ancient gravity, pulling history toward it again and again. Athens may have fallen, Rome may have silenced its citizens, monarchs may have outlawed assemblies, but the idea returned, because at its heart, democracy is not merely a system of government. It is a belief in human dignity, that every person, no matter how humble, carries a spark of sovereignty. To silence that spark is to deny humanity itself. When one stands in the quiet of a polling booth, pencil in hand, the weight of this history presses close. That small mark on paper carries the echo of centuries of forbidden whispers, revolutions, sacrifices, and blood. It carries Athens and Rousseau, Philadelphia and Paris, Prague and Cape Town. It carries the terror kings once felt when they imagined the people rising. But democracy, for all its danger, is not an end point. It is a beginning, a door that opens to further questions. If the people can claim sovereignty, what else can they claim? If power is not fixed by divine decree, then perhaps knowledge itself is not bound by authority. Just as the collective voice of citizens once threatened thrones, the collective inquiry of minds would soon threaten dogma. Democracy of governance would point toward democracy of knowledge, the daring hidden sciences that rulers also tried to suppress. For most of human history, what could not be seen was either denied or declared divine. Illness was punishment from the gods, a fever sent as retribution, a plague as judgment. Death came not from unseen organisms, but from angered spirits, curses, or the will of heaven. The invisible was not merely mystery, it was power. Priests interpreted it, rulers invoked it, healers whispered over it. To suggest otherwise, to claim that the unseen world might be natural rather than supernatural, was to tear away the veil that held entire societies together. And yet, people could not help but notice cracks in the story. If sickness was punishment, why did children innocent of sin die in such numbers? If plagues were sent from the heavens, why did they follow patterns, returning in seasons, spreading along roads, moving like tides rather than thunderbolts? Beneath fear, observation stirred. Something in the invisible world did not align with the myths. The earliest glimpses of this truth were tentative. In ancient India, physicians of Ayurveda spoke of unseen seeds of disease. In Rome, Marcus Terentius Varro warned that tiny creatures, too small to see, might breed in swamps and cause illness. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars like Ibn Sina speculated that contagion was real, that diseases spread from person to person through imperceptible agents. These whispers were fragile, easily dismissed. Without proof, they remained curiosities, too weak to topple divine explanations. But the world itself continued to speak in patterns. When the Black Death swept across Europe in the 14th century, killing nearly half the population, priests cried of God's wrath. Yet others noticed details that did not fit. The disease followed trade routes, striking towns before villages, ports before inland. It spread not where sin was greatest, but where rats and fleas thrived. People began to ask dangerous questions. What if plague was not the judgment of heaven, but the consequence of nature? Such questions risked blasphemy, but they also carried survival. Some towns that practiced crude quarantines, isolating ships for 40 days before docking, saw reduced death. Action based on observation, not ritual, began to save lives. Still, the invisible remained elusive. Without instruments, without lenses fine enough, humanity could only guess. For centuries, belief in miasma, the idea that disease spread through poisoned air, dominated medicine. Cities burned incense, carried herbs, wore masks shaped like bird beaks, all to ward off bad air. It was partly right, partly wrong, and entirely insufficient. The true culprits, the invisible armies of microbes, marched unseen. The shift came slowly, through glass. When the microscope was refined in the 17th century, a hidden universe cracked open. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, peering through his lenses, described animalcules swimming in drops of water. To most, these observations were curiosities, marvels without meaning. But in time they whispered of a revolution. The world was filled with unseen life. The air, the water, the body itself, all teemed with invisible actors. To believe this was unsettling. If tiny creatures lived all around and within us, then the boundary between health and sickness was porous, fragile. Human beings were not masters of their world, but hosts, prey, ecosystems in themselves. The ancient comfort of believing disease came from gods or demons gave way to a new, more disturbing possibility. Death could come from something unimaginably small, crawling unseen across a cup, a hand, a breath. By the 19th century, bold thinkers transformed speculation into theory. Louis Pasteur demonstrated that fermentation and spoilage were caused by microbes, not spontaneous decay. He showed that sterilization could preserve, vaccination could protect. Robert Koch proved that specific diseases, tuberculosis, anthrax, cholera, were caused by specific microbes. This was not just science, it was heresy against the old order. To say that plague was not divine punishment, but bacterial invasion, was to strip priests of their authority, to reduce cosmic judgment into biology. For some this was liberating, for others it was intolerable. Hospitals, churches, and governments resisted. Doctors ridiculed the idea of hand-washing, even as evidence mounted. Ignaz Semmelweis, who urged physicians to wash hands between dissecting corpses and delivering babies, was mocked, rejected, and driven into despair. His insistence that invisible agents carried death was too humiliating for the profession to accept. Better, many thought, to let women die of fever than to admit the unseen world was real. And yet, the truth spread. Once seen, it could not be unseen. Germ theory reshaped medicine, sanitation, and daily life. Clean water, sterilized instruments, quarantines, and vaccines all flowed from the recognition of invisible killers. Life expectancy soared. Cities that had once stank of sewage and death grew healthier. Humanity learned to fight not demons but microbes. But knowledge is never innocent. The same recognition that germs kill also birthed new fears. If the unseen world could heal, it could also be weaponized. Armies imagined invisible enemies loosed not by accident, but by design. Bioweapons became the dark twin of germ theory. Proof that every discovery carries a shadow. Beyond disease, other invisible worlds were revealed. Atoms, once hypothesized by ancient philosophers, became the building blocks of all matter. The discovery that everything, stone, air, flesh, was composed of unseen particles was dizzying. Reality itself was no longer solid, but granular, vibrating, restless. To some this was exhilarating, to others it was destabilizing. If the world was built from invisible matter, then ancient metaphysics crumbled. There was no need for spirits animating flesh if atoms explained life. And beyond atoms, forces. Electricity and magnetism, once dismissed as curiosities, revealed themselves as invisible currents shaping reality. Lightning in the sky was the same force that could power lamps. Magnetism that guided compasses was the unseen thread, binding metals and fields. Human progress surged as these invisible forces were harnessed, but again belief systems trembled. To say storms were not divine anger but electrical discharge was to wound mythology. To say healing came not from prayers, but from unseen currents of biology was to dethrone entire institutions. The invisible world illuminated science, but it also unsettled humanity's sense of place. Just as Copernicus and Galileo had dethroned Earth from the center of the cosmos, germ theory and atomic science dethroned humanity from certainty. We were not punished by gods, but invaded by microbes. We were not built from sacred essence, but from particles shared with stones and stars. The world was not what it seemed. Reality was stranger, deeper, more intricate, and far more dangerous. Religion did not vanish. Many adapted, folding new knowledge into old frameworks. But the rupture was undeniable. Where once priests had commanded obedience with the threat of divine plague, now doctors, scientists, and engineers commanded trust with microscopes, vaccines, and electricity. Power shifted from altar to laboratory. The invisible world had been reclaimed, not for spirits but for science. Yet the shift was not complete, nor was it entirely safe. Even now, belief in unseen forces persists outside science. Superstitions cling, faiths endure, alternative explanations thrive. For many, the idea that germs or atoms explain life feels too cold, too mechanical. Mystery comforts where science unsettles. And in that gap between what science reveals and what humans long to believe, conflict simmers. What makes the invisible world so dangerous is not only its truth, but its implications. To see disease as biology is to demand clean water, hospitals, vaccines, investments in public good. To see matter as atomic is to build weapons of unfathomable destruction. To see forces as electrical is to construct networks that bind billions in webs of energy and communication. The invisible, once revealed, does not sit quietly. It reshapes society, redistributes power, creates new dangers. And perhaps this is the deepest unease. If so much of reality is invisible, how much more lies beyond even now? What forces, particles, or life forms remain unseen, waiting to be uncovered? Each revelation opens new horizons, but also new terrors. If germs can kill, unseen if atoms can split with fire, what else might the hidden world hold? Humanity steps forward, but always at the edge of dread. The invisible world whispers a final lesson. Power does not always roar from the heavens. Sometimes it slips silently through breath, through blood, through the smallest fragments of matter. To ignore it is fatal. To understand it is transformative. But to wield it, this is where illumination edges into shadow. Because every discovery of the invisible carries its twin, the possibility of misuse, of corruption, of darkness. And so, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the invisible world of germs, atoms, and forces prepared humanity for our even more dangerous knowledge. Beyond biology, beyond matter, beyond electricity, there were ideas even darker. Sciences so forbidden that rulers, priests, and even scientists themselves hesitated to name them. If the invisible world had unsettled, society, what came next, would haunt it. Since the dawn of storytelling, humanity has spun tales of beings made not by gods but by human hands. Across cultures and centuries, legends of artificial life emerged as whispers of both triumph and terror. The Greeks spoke of Hephaestus, the divine smith, who forged golden maidens that could think and move. The Jewish mystics told of the golem, a clay figure animated by sacred words, powerful but soulless. In medieval alchemy, the homunculus, a tiny man conjured in glass, was said to be born from arcane mixtures. Each myth pointed to the same forbidden thought. What if mortals could create life, not merely inherit it? At first, these stories were safely distant, folded into religion or magic. Automata built in ancient times, water clocks, mechanical birds, moving statues, were marvels of craftsmanship, but they did not think. They entertained, they astonished, but they never threatened. Still, the idea lingered. If gears and springs could mimic flight, if wires and weights could mimic music, could not more intricate designs one day mimic thought itself? To entertain such a possibility was to chip away at the sacred uniqueness of humanity. In most traditions, to live and to think was to bear the spark of the divine. To suggest that spark could be replicated with clay, metal, or mathematics was dangerous, even heretical. What separated humans from beasts, humans from gods, humans from machines, if thought itself could be manufactured? This question was never fully buried. It resurfaced in each era, pressing itself against the limits of human imagination. The Golem legends capture this danger vividly. In Prague, it was said that Rabbi Judah Lew created a giant of clay to defend the Jewish people from persecution. The golem was strong, tireless, obedient, until it was not. In some versions of the tale, the golem grew violent, uncontainable, forcing its maker to destroy it. The story echoed a warning: artificial life may serve, but it may also rebel. To create a mind is to risk losing control of it. Behind the allegory lay a deeper fear, that humanity, in imitating creation, would unleash something it could not command. Renaissance thinkers, too, flirted with the idea of artificial life. Alchemists whispered of ways to fashion homunculi and flasks, tiny human-like beings with rudimentary awareness. These tales, half metaphor and half experiment, revealed both ambition and anxiety. The very thought that one could conjure intelligence raised questions of hubris. Was it blasphemy to play creator? Was the attempt to fashion new minds an act of genius, or a folly destined for punishment? By the Enlightenment, the myth edged closer to science. Automata of increasing complexity dazzled Europe. Mechanical musicians, artificial ducks that ate and excreted, dolls that could write letters with human-like flourish. Crowds gasped, nobles marveled. These machines did not think, but they blurred the line. If the movements of the body could be copied with gears, could the movements of thought not also be imitated? The philosopher René Descartes suggested animals might be little more than machines, their behaviors reducible to intricate mechanics. Others dared to wonder, if animals were machines, were humans not machines too, albeit more elaborate? The danger of this idea lay not in the gears, but in the philosophy. To imagine the mind as mechanical was to demystify it. The soul became optional, consciousness a byproduct, thought reducible to process. For rulers and priests who relied on humanity's sense of divine uniqueness, this was subversive. If humans could be machines, then machines could one day be human. The Industrial Revolution fanned the flames of this fear. As factories churned, workers themselves seemed reduced to cogs in vast machines. The metaphor grew literal. Steam engines, looms and locomotives demonstrated that human labor could be replaced by mechanical force. If the body could be replaced, could the mind be far behind? Mary Shelley's Frankenstein gave this anxiety its most haunting form. A creature assembled from dead flesh and jolted into life by scientific daring. Shelley's monster was intelligent, articulate, yearning, and monstrous not because of its mind, but because of its rejection. The novel whispered that the true horror was not creation itself, but the refusal to grant it humanity. By the 20th century, the machine mind leapt from myth into mathematics. With the birth of computing, the idea of artificial intelligence shed its cloak of mysticism and entered laboratories. Alan Turing asked the dangerous question outright: if machines can follow rules, learn patterns, and solve problems, might they not one day think? He proposed a test, the imitation game, whereby a machine could be said to think if it could converse indistinguishably from a human. The challenge was no longer mythic, but empirical. Humanity had moved from fearing the golem of clay to building the golem of circuits. But with this came dread. If machines could think, would they also feel? If they could learn, would they outlearn? The old warnings resurfaced in new clothes. The obedient servant might become the uncontrollable rebel. The mind forged by humans might surpass its makers. What would remain of human uniqueness if the very act of thought could be shared or eclipsed by machines? Popular culture amplified these fears. Stories of robots rising against masters, computers plotting destruction, artificial beings demanding rights, all echoed the same unease. To imagine the machine mind was to stare into a mirror and wonder if the reflection would replace us. Science. Fiction served not only as entertainment, but as prophecy. cautioning against the consequences of success. Every myth of rebellion, from the golem to the Terminator, carried the same moral. Creation may exceed control, yet fear alone could not halt progress. Computers grew faster, algorithms sharper, networks vaster. The 21st century saw machine learning blossom, with artificial intelligence able to recognize speech, generate images, diagnose illness, and write words once thought the exclusive domain of human creativity. Each advance blurred the line further. When a machine composes music or crafts stories, is it mimicking intelligence or demonstrating it? When it beats humans at games of strategy, is it merely calculation or something closer to foresight? The danger is not merely philosophical. A machine mind, once powerful enough, could reshape society. Jobs vanish as algorithms replace workers. Decisions once made by judges, doctors, or generals slide into the hands of automated systems. The machine mind becomes not only a tool, but an authority. Trust, once reserved for humans, shifts toward processes no human fully understands. And beneath all this lies the deepest fear. What if intelligence is not unique to humans at all? What if thought is not sacred but replicable, not divine but mechanical? Such a realization strikes at the core of identity. Religions have long taught that humanity is set apart by soul or reason, but if machines can reason, where then is the soul? If they can learn, feel, and decide, what remains to distinguish? The human? The danger of the machine mind is not merely rebellion, it is the dissolution of uniqueness. This is why myths of artificial life endure. From clay giants to computer codes, they speak to the same forbidden truth. Intelligence may not be singular. Creation may not be reserved for gods. And if humans are no longer unique, then the hierarchy of the universe, gods above, humans below, animals beneath, collapses into something far stranger. Even now, as machines draft letters, generate art, and converse with us, the old dread lingers. We marvel at the brilliance and recoil from the implications. To dream of the machine mind is to glimpse both power and peril. For with it comes the possibility that humanity has already set into motion its successor. The myths warned us. The legends of golems and homunculi, the nightmares of Frankenstein, the parables of rebellion, they were not merely fictions, but rehearsals for reality. The dangerous question has always been the same. Can we create minds? And if so, what will they want? Will they serve? Will they partner? Or will they replace? The machine mind does not yet walk freely among us, but in laboratories, in networks, in algorithms humming invisibly through our lives, it already breathes. Each advance brings us closer to a threshold we may not recognize until it is crossed. And once crossed, there may be no return. For the mind, once unleashed, cannot easily be caged again. Thus, the idea of the machine mind is both dream and nightmare. It is the culmination of centuries of myth, science, and ambition, and it carries within it the seeds of existential danger. For if intelligence can be built, then so too can it be built beyond us, smarter, faster, less fragile. And what role then would remain for the makers? The thought is exhilarating, the thought is terrifying, and it leads us, inevitably, into the darkest question of all. If machines can think, might they also one day decide that humanity itself is unnecessary? For most of human history, the universe was imagined as a closed container, a dome or a sphere that sheltered the fragile earth within. Ancient peoples looked up at the stars and saw a roof dotted with lights, a ceiling adorned by gods. The cosmos was finite, ordered, and most importantly centered around us. Earth was the stage, humanity the actors, and the heavens the backdrop. To believe otherwise was unthinkable, even dangerous, because to remove the earth from its privileged position was to erode the story of human centrality itself. Yet the night sky whispered something different. Its endless blackness seemed too vast, too unbounded for such comforting limits. The stars did not look like lamps set upon a dome. They looked like distant fires, scattered without end. And to those who dared to contemplate such possibilities, the price was often exile, persecution, or death. One of the earliest voices to suggest this heretical vision was Giordano Bruno, a wandering Dominican friar of the 16th century. Bruno was not a cautious man, nor was he satisfied with half measures. He declared boldly that the universe had no edge, that stars were suns, and that each sun might be circled by its own planets, perhaps even inhabited by beings like or unlike ourselves. He proclaimed that creation was infinite, that no center existed, that humanity was not unique but one of countless expressions of cosmic life. In the Italy of the Counter-Reformation, this was no mere speculation. It was treason against the sacred narrative. The Church taught that Earth was God's singular stage, the scene of fall and redemption, the cradle of creation. To multiply worlds was to multiply meanings, to fracture the story of salvation. Bruno was imprisoned, tortured, and in 1600, burned, alive in Rome's Campo dei Fiori. His crime was not simply defying doctrine, but daring to suggest that the universe did not bend itself around us. His flames were meant to extinguish infinity itself, yet ideas, unlike bodies, are hard to burn. The suggestion of infinity endured, quietly feeding on the discoveries of others. Copernicus had already displaced Earth from the center, placing the sun in its stead. Galileo's telescope revealed moons orbiting Jupiter, worlds beyond our own, challenging the notion of heavenly perfection. Over time, each discovery loosened the bonds of centrality. The Earth was no longer the center of the solar system. The solar system was no longer the center of the galaxy, and the galaxy was not the center of anything at all. The deeper humanity peered, the more it seemed we were suspended in a vastness, without anchor, drifting in a sea without shores. The 20th century only deepened this vertigo. When Edwin Hubble demonstrated that galaxies themselves were receding from us, the implication was staggering. Not only was the universe enormous, it was expanding. Space itself stretched, carrying stars and galaxies with it like leaves scattered. On an inflating balloon. If it was expanding now, it must have once been smaller, denser, hotter, hence the Big Bang, a beginning not written in sacred text, but inscribed in the very fabric of space-time. With every telescope, every radio dish, every orbiting observatory, the scale expanded further. Billions of galaxies, each with billions of stars, each perhaps with planets, each perhaps with life. Infinity was no longer a mystical dream, but a scientific horizon. And yet, for all its evidence, the infinite universe still carries a dangerous weight. To accept it fully is to accept our smallness. The human story shrinks against such immensity. In an infinite cosmos, what is a nation, a king, a faith, a single life? Entire civilizations become mere sparks, blinking and fading unnoticed in the ocean of stars. The sense of cosmic loneliness is suffocating. If other beings exist, they are impossibly far, their light perhaps extinguished before it reaches us. If we are alone, the silence is even heavier, for then the infinite cosmos is populated only by mute stars and indifferent void. To contemplate. Infinity is to strip away the comfort of centrality and to sit quietly with insignificance. And yet there is awe too, for in that insignificance lies something profound. We are matter become aware, the universe contemplating itself. If infinity makes us small, it also gives us context. The atoms in our bodies were forged in stars that died before the earth was born. The iron in our blood, the calcium in our bones, the carbon in our breath, all of it was cooked in ancient furnaces, scattered through explosions, gathered into clouds, and pressed into planets. To exist is to carry within us the memory of suns. Infinity is not only vast and lonely, but intimate, stitched into our very cells. To look at the night sky is to see not strangers, but ancestors. Still, the danger of infinity is that it refuses to end. Every boundary humanity has drawn has eventually dissolved. The horizon gave way to oceans, the oceans to continents, the continents to the globe. The globe yielded to the solar system to the galaxy to the observable universe, and even the observable universe may not be all. Cosmologists speak of the multiverse, of infinite other universes with different laws, different forms of matter, perhaps even different mathematics. If that is true, then our cosmos is but a bubble in a foam of countless others, fragile, temporary, unremarkable. Infinity becomes not just space but possibility, a branching endlessness in which every certainty falters. What does it mean for humanity to live in such a universe? Some cling to the old comforts, insisting Earth must still matter uniquely. That consciousness must still have a divine source. That meaning must still be anchored in cosmic centrality. Others embrace the vertigo, finding meaning not in being special, but in being part of something immeasurably greater. Between these poles stretches the quiet unease of modern existence. We live in an infinite universe, and we do not know what that makes us. But perhaps this is the lesson. Infinity humbles, but it also frees. If the universe is boundless, then so too are the horizons of thought. The old punishments for heresy, the flames that consumed Bruno, the chains that silenced. Galileo cannot burn infinity away. Knowledge expands, and with it, imagination. To meditate on infinity is to confront the mystery that has always haunted us. Not why the universe is vast, but why we are here to notice it at all. And here lies the transition, delicate yet profound. For if the universe is infinite outwardly, then the next question is whether infinity also dwells inwardly. The cosmos stretches beyond the reach of telescopes, but within the human mind lies another expanse, equally mysterious. Consciousness itself, the awareness that contemplates infinity, may be the next forbidden frontier. Just as the stars once seemed divine until we learned they were suns, so too might thought, memory, and imagination prove to be universes in miniature. The battleground of ideas shifts now from the heavens above to the depths within, where the infinite landscape of the human mind awaits its reckoning. For centuries, people believed that the mind was not a private chamber but a sacred vessel, a soul given and guarded by divine authority, untouchable by human inquiry, and to question its workings was not only arrogant but blasphemous. To suggest that thoughts, dreams, fears, and desires arose from within us, rather than being dictated by gods, spirits, or demons, was to trespass on forbidden ground. The mind was the last true mystery, the invisible heart of human existence, and to gaze too closely at it was to unravel the structures of power that depended upon mystery itself. Priests claimed to interpret divine will, kings claimed authority through divine right, and entire societies were governed by the assumption that human beings were vessels of forces beyond themselves. But what if the truth was that the mind was its own world, as vast as the cosmos and as subject to laws that could be studied, mapped, and understood? To suggest such a thing was dangerous because it placed power back in the individual, back in the capacity to look inward and see with one's own eyes the machinery of thought, memory, and desire. In the ancient world, dreams were the first sign that the mind contained its own secrets. To dream was to step into a shadow world that felt both familiar and alien, filled with symbols, terrors, and visions. Temples in Egypt and Greece were devoted to dream interpretation, where priests acted as mediators between the dreamer and the gods. Dreams were seen as messages from beyond, prophecies or warnings that revealed divine plans. Yet quietly, some thinkers wondered whether dreams might not be external messages at all, but the play of the mind upon itself. Aristotle speculated that dreams came from within, the result of internal impressions rather than heavenly communications. His suggestion was radical because it stripped priests of their interpretive authority. If a dream was nothing more than the mind mirroring itself, then the gateway to truth was not in the temple, but in the sleeper's own skull. Such ideas flickered in the margins of ancient philosophy, dangerous but largely ignored, for the power of religion to command interpretation was too great. The Middle Ages locked the mind firmly under religious guardianship. To suffer madness was to be possessed, to experience visions was to be chosen or cursed. Priests and inquisitors decided whether such experiences were holy revelations or heretical temptations. To suggest that madness might have causes within the mind or that visions might arise from the imagination was to risk charges of blasphemy. The Church required mystery. Mystery kept its authority intact. But even in this climate, occasional heretics whispered about the inner self. Mystics like Meister Eckhart, spoke of an inner ground of the soul that connected to God, not through ritual but through inward reflection. Such teachings were dangerous because they implied that each person could turn inward and find truth without the mediation of church or king. Again and again such whispers were silenced, but the idea never died. The mind was a mirror, and in its depths one might glimpse truths forbidden by society. It was not until the 19th century that the mirror of the mind began to be polished with the instruments of science. Sigmund Freud, a physician from Vienna, proposed something shocking, that our thoughts and actions were shaped not only by reason and will, but by hidden desires, unconscious fears, and buried memories. To Freud, the mind was not a clear vessel, but a layered structure, with the conscious self floating atop a vast sea of the subconscious. Dreams were not divine messages but disguised wishes, fragments of repressed desire surfacing in symbolic form. Symptoms of madness or neurosis were not punishments from God, but eruptions of the unconscious tangled knots of memory and fear. Freud's theories shattered the illusion of rational sovereignty. If true, they suggested that each person was not master of themselves, but a battleground of forces they could barely name. This was not only a scientific claim, it was political dynamite. If priests could no longer claim dreams as divine, if kings could no longer claim the mind as sacred soil for obedience, then authority itself trembled. Carl Jung, Freud's one-time disciple, carried this danger further. Where Freud saw personal repression, Jung saw collective archetypes, myths and symbols that lived not in heaven, but in the deep structures of the psyche itself. Gods and demons, he argued, were not external beings, but reflections of universal patterns in the human mind. To Jung, even religion was a psychological phenomenon, a projection of inner archetypes onto the world. This idea was profoundly unsettling, for it suggested that all the structures of belief, all the cathedrals and altars and sacred rites, were in some sense mirrors of human psychology. If the gods lived in us, then who needed the priests? If myth was born from the unconscious, then who needed kings to enforce divine law? The danger of psychology lay precisely here. It stripped away external authority and replaced it with inner exploration. Once people began to believe that their nightmares came not from demons, but from memory, that their visions came not from God, but from the subconscious, the scaffolding of traditional power shook. To study the mind was to reclaim ownership of the self. To analyze dreams by candlelight, to sit with the whispering fragments of memory, was to turn away from the pulpit and toward the private theater of the soul. No empire could long withstand such a redirection of attention, for if freedom existed anywhere, it existed first in thought. To govern one's own mind was to resist the command to surrender it to kings or gods. And yet, psychology did not only liberate, it unsettled. To realize that we are shaped by unconscious forces is to realize that freedom is fragile. The self is not a sovereign fortress, but a delicate balancing act of desire, fear, and memory. We are not always who we think we are. This realization is dangerous not just to rulers, but to individuals, for it reveals the instability of identity itself. What we call I is a shifting reflection in the mirror of the mind, never fixed, always refracted through the hidden, a glass of unconscious influence. To face this is to feel awe and dread, the same dread that once came from gazing at the infinite stars. Infinity outward, infinity inward, both destabilize the comforting illusion of centrality. As psychology spread, so did resistance. Freud's writings were banned in fascist regimes. Psychoanalysts were driven into exile, their ideas deemed corrupting and dangerous. Totalitarian states feared the inward gaze, for a citizen who examined their own mind too deeply was harder to mold. Even in democracies, psychology was eyed with suspicion, its revelations too disruptive to established norms of morality and order. And yet the mirror of the mind could not be smashed. Every new discovery in neuroscience, every study of memory, every exploration of dreams polished the mirror further. The more we learned, the more it became impossible to deny. The final frontier of freedom lies not in laws or armies, but in the quiet, ungovernable terrain of thought. Dreams, once chained to temples and prophecies, now belong to the dreamer. Desires, once punished as sins, are now examined as psychological facts. Madness, once chained in asylums as divine punishment, is now understood as suffering that demands care and empathy. Each shift represents a revolution in authority, a slow liberation of the individual from the grip of external power. But this liberation is precarious, for as rulers of old sought to control land, wealth, and bodies, modern powers have sought to control minds, through propaganda, through ideology, through the subtle machinery of suggestion. The mirror of the mind, once forbidden to look into, is now coveted as a tool of manipulation. The danger has shifted from priests who feared psychology to states that seek to weaponize it. And so we arrive at a paradox. The mind is the final sanctuary of freedom, yet also the most vulnerable frontier of control. To know oneself is liberation. To be known by others, by rulers, by institutions, by machines, is peril. The forbidden study of the psyche has become the coveted prize of politics, for he who can shape thought can shape the world. Thus, the mirror of the mind, once feared by kings and priests, now casts its reflection onto the looming dangers of modern governance. What began as whispers about dreams and subconscious forces has become a battleground where psychology meets power, where freedom of thought itself stands in jeopardy. And so the story turns, naturally, inevitably, toward the political dangers of knowledge, where the inner world and the outer world collide in struggles over who may own the human soul. There are few thoughts more quietly explosive than the idea that no human being has the right to rule another. For it is a thought that strikes not only at kings and emperors, but at the very principle of hierarchy itself, dissolving the great chain of command upon which societies have always been built. And when whispered in the streets, in taverns, in the corners of meeting houses, it has shaken governments more than revolutions fought in the name of replacing one ruler with another. Anarchism, the doctrine of no masters, is often caricatured as chaos, fire, and bomb-throwing. Yet at its heart, it is a slow and unsettling philosophy, not the denial of order, but the refusal of imposed domination, a belief that people are capable of governing themselves through mutual aid, through cooperation, through bonds of community rather than chains of command. It is dangerous not because it promises chaos, but because it suggests that power in the hands of rulers, landlords, generals, priests, is unnecessary, illegitimate, and perhaps even parasitic. From the earliest days of empire, the mere whisper of such a possibility frightened those who lived in palaces and sat upon thrones, for it implied that their crowns were empty, their armies fragile, their laws nothing but paper, and their authority only a habit of obedience waiting to be broken. The Roman Empire feared not only foreign invaders, but also the stubborn independence of small communities who resisted the yoke, declaring that they would not pay tribute, would not kneel to distant emperors, would not acknowledge Caesar as lord. In every age, governments feared not the rebellion that sought a new master, but the defiance that sought no master at all, for that is the rebellion that cannot be pacified by compromise, bribes, or succession, the rebellion that will not replace the old banners with new ones but will burn banners altogether. The dangerous thing about anarchism is that it does not begin with slogans or manifestos, though those have their place, but with a simple question: why should anyone rule me? This question, asked slowly and sincerely, begins to unravel the tapestry of power, because each justification for authority, tradition, divine right, wealth, law, majority rule, reveals itself to be contingent, fragile, and constructed. Kings once ruled because God had ordained them, yet when philosophers and revolutionaries began to challenge that claim, monarchy wavered. Democracies arose, claiming legitimacy from the will of the people, yet anarchists asked the unsettling follow-up. Why should 51% have the right to rule 49%? Why should even a majority have sovereignty over the individual conscience? And in asking that question, anarchism revealed itself not as an ideology of disorder, but as a philosophy of skepticism toward power itself, an insistence that no arrangement of authority, no matter how carefully dressed, was beyond scrutiny. Governments across centuries have trembled, not because anarchists proposed an alternative government, but because they proposed no government, because they took away the very premise upon which all rulers justify themselves, the assumption that rule is necessary. History remembers anarchists as bomb throwers, yet the most radical and dangerous anarchist acts have often been acts of creation, not destruction. The building of communes, the organization of worker cooperatives, the formation of mutual aid, societies where food, medicine, and education are shared without permission from kings or parliaments. These experiments reveal the frightening truth that people can, in fact, organize themselves, that order can emerge without commands, and that justice can grow without the shadow of police and prisons. The Paris Commune of 1871, short-lived but unforgettable, was one such experiment, when ordinary citizens briefly seized their city and attempted to govern themselves through collective councils rather than a centralized state. To rulers across Europe, the Commune was not terrifying because of its violence, but because of its possibility. It suggested that workers and neighbors, left to their own devices, could govern daily life more effectively than the elaborate apparatus of state. This idea, more than barricades or rifles, was the true threat, for if order can exist without rulers, then rulers are unnecessary, and if rulers are unnecessary, then the entire edifice of state power crumbles. The terror of anarchism to governments lies in its universality. Other political movements may seek power for a particular class, a particular party, a particular ideology. Anarchism, however, denies power itself, and thus it threatens every government equally, whether monarchy, empire, republic, or dictatorship. It is a solvent that dissolves every justification of authority, a quiet acid eating at the foundations of palaces. That is why anarchist thinkers and activists have so often been vilified, imprisoned, executed, or erased from history books. Governments cannot afford for their citizens to believe, even for a moment, that life without masters might be possible, because such belief is more subversive than any weapon. In Russia, anarchists were crushed not only by the Tsars but also by the Bolsheviks, who, after seizing power in the name of revolution, discovered that anarchists remained a threat precisely because they would not trade one master for another. In Spain, during the Civil War of the 1930s, anarchists established vast territories organized through federations of workers and peasants, building schools, farms, and militias without bosses or generals, and for a brief time, they demonstrated that anarchism was not an abstract dream but a lived reality. Yet both fascists and communists destroyed these communities, united only in their fear of a world without masters. The unsettling power of anarchism is that it reveals the fragility of obedience. Most of human history has been built upon the assumption that people must obey or chaos will result. But anarchism points out that most of the order in daily life, families, raising children, neighbors helping neighbors, farmers planting crops, artisans crafting goods, exists without rulers, without commands, without laws imposed from above. The state does not teach a child to walk, does not comfort the grieving, does not invent the wheel or the plow. These arise from human creativity, cooperation, and care. If such things can emerge without authority, then perhaps more can. Anarchism's radical whisper is that people already live without masters in much of their lives, and that extending this principle is not madness, but simply honesty. This whisper terrifies governments more than shouts, because it requires no violence, no overthrow, only a quiet refusal to believe in the necessity of rulers. And yet anarchism is not without its shadows. Its critics ask, without rulers, how will disputes be settled? How will the strong be prevented from dominating the weak? How will resources be distributed fairly? These are valid questions, and anarchists themselves have wrestled with them for centuries. Some argue for federations of local councils, others for voluntary contracts, still others for mutual aid networks that grow as naturally as ecosystems. The answers are diverse, sometimes contradictory, but the core remains. Authority is not a given, it must justify itself, and where it cannot, it must be rejected. This insistence is dangerous because it undermines not only governments, but also the subtle hierarchies of daily life, patriarchy, racism, class dominance, systems of rule that embed themselves in homes, workplaces, and traditions. To question masters in the palace is to eventually question masters in the household, masters in the marketplace, masters in the factory. And this chain of questioning stretches endlessly outward. Governments across history have feared anarchists, not only for what they said, but for the example they set. For each time people governed themselves without permission, they created cracks in the myth that rulers were essential. A strike organized without union leaders, a neighborhood defending itself without police, a school taught without state curriculum. These are small but dangerous demonstrations, proof that people can do what they are told they cannot. That is why anarchists have been hounded, ridiculed, and erased, not because they were violent, though some were, but because they were effective at revealing the hollowness of authority. If people believe that no one has the right to rule them, the empire is already in ruins, even if its armies still march. And so the idea of no masters persists, unsettling, whispering through history like a ghost that refuses to be exorcised. It appears in slave revolts, in peasant uprisings, in communes and cooperatives, in every act of solidarity that bypasses the state. It does not vanish because it is rooted in something deeper than ideology, the lived experience of freedom, the recognition that domination is not natural but imposed. Like the infinite universe or the subconscious mind, it is an idea that once glimpsed cannot be unseen. It frightens rulers because it suggests that power is unnecessary. It unsettles citizens because it suggests that responsibility is theirs. To live without masters is not simply to reject authority, but to embrace autonomy, to accept the burden of freedom, and that burden is heavy enough to frighten even those who dream of it. Thus, anarchism remains a forbidden philosophy, feared, more than democracy, more than socialism, more than revolution, because it does not seek to rearrange power but to abolish it. Its danger lies not in destruction, but in creation, not in violence but in the possibility of a world organized differently. And this possibility leads, inevitably, to the next question, the next forbidden inquiry. If no one has the right to rule, then what of wealth, of property, of ownership itself? For if rulers are illegitimate, what of landlords? If power cannot be justified, what of capital? The whisper of no masters, once heard, becomes the whisper of no masters in economy as well as politics. And so, slowly, uneasily, the story turns toward the most dangerous of questions. Who has the right to own and who has the right to deny? There is a peculiar danger in ideas that do not merely describe the world, but reorganize it from the ground up. And few ideas have been so quietly transformative and so profoundly destabilizing as those bound up with the notion of value, money, trade, and economy. To imagine a time before these abstractions is to imagine a human world that seems alien to us now. Small bands of people exchanging gifts, favors, or goods without ledger or price, where reciprocity was remembered in stories and in obligations, carried by trust, not written into contracts or etched on coins. Yet as soon as human beings began to distill labor and need into tokens, to assign number where once there was only relationship, something irreversible began. Money, trade, and later the great systems called capitalism, socialism, and communism were not mere conveniences, but dangerous inventions because they altered the very fabric of society, reshaping not just how people lived, but how they thought about themselves, about others, and about the world. The first coins in Lydia, simple discs of metal stamped with symbols, were revolutionary. They abstracted value from substance, allowing a sack of grain, a day of work, or a weapon to be represented in a single transferable object. With that shift came mobility, ambition, and the possibility of accumulation beyond the immediate needs of survival. But with that also came inequality, debt, and the unsettling recognition that the worth of human life and effort could be measured, compared, and reduced to numbers. Every great civilization carried its own dangerous experiments with value. St. Rome, the empire minted coins by the millions, spreading across continents, binding far-flung peoples into an economy that depended as much on trust in currency as it did on legions. But debasement of coinage, the gradual mixing of precious metal with baser substances, revealed the fragility of that trust. Entire economies could wobble on the discovery that silver was not as pure as promised. And with these fluctuations came social unrest, rebellion, collapse. In China, the invention of paper money in the Tang and Song dynasties represented another leap, a recognition that value could be detached even from metal, resting instead on faith in authority, in empire, in the promise that a slip of paper could conjure food or shelter. That promise, however, was not always kept. Inflation, counterfeiting, and loss of confidence led not only to economic ruin, but to the toppling of dynasties. Again and again, societies learned that money is not neutral. It is belief crystallized, and when belief falters, entire orders fall. But money was only the beginning. The truly dangerous turn came with systems, ways of organizing production, labor, and wealth that sought not just to enable exchange but to define it. Capitalism, with its emphasis on private ownership, competition, and profit, has unleashed astonishing creativity, innovation, and wealth. It has given us machines, medicines, technologies that lengthen life and broaden possibility. But it has also commodified human existence, reducing forests, rivers, even time itself into things with prices. The logic of the market does not stop at goods. It seeps into relationships, art, even morality. Under capitalism, questions of worth are rephrased. Not what is right, but what is profitable. Not what is beautiful, but what sells. It is dangerous because it is persuasive, cloaking itself in the neutrality of numbers, while eroding values that cannot be measured. Entire cultures have been reconfigured by its logic. Villages emptied as labor migrates to factories. Traditions abandoned because they cannot compete in the market. In capitalism's promise of freedom lies its peril, the freedom of the wealthy to shape the world in their image, the freedom of those without wealth to starve. Socialism emerged as both critique and alternative, insisting that value should not be determined by private accumulation, but by collective need. Its danger lay not only in its challenge to entrenched elites, but in its sweeping vision of equality. To say that wealth should be redistributed, that the worker should own the means of production, that profit should be subordinate to fairness, is to unsettle every hierarchy built over centuries. And so, when socialist movements arose, in Paris, in Petrograd, in Havana, they were greeted not just with opposition but with fear. For the wealthy, socialism was not an argument, but an existential threat, an idea that if enacted would dissolve their privilege. And yet, socialism too carried its risks. In practice, it often relied on the concentration of power in the state, and when states fail or corrupt, the dream of equality curdles into tyranny. Still, the persistence of socialism across centuries testifies to the enduring discontent with the inequality of markets and to the dangerous allure of imagining a society where no child starves and no worker is exploited. Communism, more radical still, sought not reform, but revolution. It declared that history itself was a struggle of classes, that the old order could not be fixed but must be destroyed, that private property itself should be abolished. In its purest form, it envisioned a world without masters and slaves, without rich and poor, without states and borders. For rulers, landlords, and kings, there could be no more terrifying idea. It undermined not only their wealth, but the very legitimacy of their rule. And when communism was tried in the 20th century, it brought both hope and horror. It lifted millions from poverty, educated the illiterate, gave rights to the forgotten. But it also imposed brutal regimes, famines, purges, gulags. The danger of communism was not only in its enemies, but in itself, in its willingness to sacrifice the present for the dream of a future, in its justification of cruelty in the name of equality. It was proof that economic ideas are not abstract. They spill blood, they move armies, they shape destinies. All of these systems, capitalism, socialism, communism, are dangerous not simply because of their policies, but because they reveal that value is not natural, it is made. The price of everything is not inscribed in the stars, but negotiated, fought over, enforced. A loaf of bread can be sacred in one context, disposable in another. A life can be priceless in one culture, expendable in another. Once societies begin to see that value is malleable, that it can be altered by decree or revolution, nothing is safe. The foundations of tradition tremble because they too may be priced, commodified, or overturned. This is why rulers, philosophers, and priests have always feared economic thought. To question the nature of money is to question the nature of power. To debate the distribution of wealth is to debate the distribution of dignity. The French Revolution did not erupt only because of philosophy, but because of bread, because of hunger, because of the unbearable price of survival. The Russian Revolution was not born only from theory, but from the grinding misery of workers and peasants who understood that the wealth of their labor was stolen. Economics, in this sense, is not about numbers, but about justice, and justice, when it collides with entrenched power, is explosive. Yet the danger of economic systems is not only in revolution, but in their subtle pervasiveness. Capitalism spreads quietly, infiltrating daily life until it feels inevitable. Socialism haunts societies, appearing in demands for healthcare, education, and housing even in the heart of capitalist nations. Communism lingers in memory, both as nightmare and as lost dream. Each continues to shape the world long after their theorists have died, because each addresses something primal in human existence, the need to eat, to work, to shelter, to survive. Political ideas may stir the mind, religious ideas may stir the soul, but economic ideas grip the body itself. That is why they are so dangerous, because they are lived every day. And beneath them all lies the original invention, the decision to translate human life into price. Once we began to ask, what is this worth, rather than, what is this for? We set ourselves on a path both wondrous and perilous. The path has given us skyscrapers, vaccines, and satellites, but it has also given us sweatshops, famines, and financial crises. We live now in a world where everything has a price: water, jeans, even attention. We live in a world where markets predict elections, where futures are traded in food, where debt binds nations as once armies did. The price of everything is the price of our world itself, but the danger deepens still. For if everything can be priced, what then is meaning? When value is not inherent but assigned, when worth is not divine but negotiated, we edge toward a final, more terrifying thought. If bread has no sacred price, if labor has no fixed dignity, if even life itself is valued differently depending on context, then what of truth, of morality, of purpose? Are they two inventions, provisional, negotiable? The systems of economics have led us to prosperity and ruin alike, but more than that, they have led us toward the abyss of a greater suspicion that nothing has inherent meaning at all. And so in the quiet unfolding of coins, in the ledgers of merchants, in the manifestos of revolutionaries, humanity has inched closer to the most dangerous idea of all. For if the price of everything can be questioned, then perhaps meaning itself can be too. And from that realization there is no turning back. There is perhaps no idea more unsettling, more dangerous and more quietly corrosive than this, that there is no meaning at all, not hidden meaning, not secret meaning, not divine meaning waiting in some far-off paradise, but no meaning, no grand design, no ultimate why. For as long as humans have gazed at the stars, prayed in temples, and written philosophies, they have searched for answers to the question, what does it all mean? But nihilism answers with silence. It whispers that meaning is an invention, not a discovery. It is not written in the stars, not encoded in sacred books, not hiding in the depths of physics. It is simply not there. The very suggestion destabilizes everything. If there is no meaning, then morality loses its anchor. Kings cannot rule by divine right. Priests cannot claim authority from heaven. Philosophers cannot point toward eternal truths. Every institution built upon the premise of inherent purpose begins to crack. And for the individual, it can feel like the ground itself dissolves underfoot. Without meaning, why live? Without purpose, why endure suffering? The idea is like an acid. It does not shatter violently like revolution, but instead slowly dissolves the bonds that hold society together. Nihilism is not one person's thought, but a shadow that follows every philosophy. Whenever a system promises to explain the world, its failure opens the door to nihilism. Ancient religions gave structure, but when their stories were doubted, the void appeared. Philosophers proposed eternal truths, but when counterarguments revealed their fragility, the void widened. Even science, which claims no moral authority, has carved away illusions that once provided comfort. The earth is not the center. Humanity is not unique. The universe is vast and indifferent. Each revelation feeds the suspicion that the search for ultimate meaning may itself be meaningless. In ancient times, there were hints. Some Greek skeptics toyed with the thought that the gods may not care, that justice might be a human invention. In India, certain strands of philosophy suggested that what we call reality may be illusion, maya, shadows cast upon nothingness. In China, Taoist texts hinted at the absurdity of clinging to fixed meaning when life itself flowed like water. But these whispers never became dominant, because civilizations required belief. They needed myths to stabilize order, stories to bind people together. A society built on the acceptance of meaninglessness would collapse before it began. And so the idea of no meaning was always buried, suppressed not by fire or sword, but by silence. It was in modernity, however, that nihilism stepped out of the shadows. Friedrich Nietzsche famously announced the death of God, not as a celebration, but as a warning. If the highest source of meaning was dead, then humanity would drift in a sea without compass or stars. For Nietzsche, this was not merely theology but psychology. Without belief, without purpose, people would face despair. He foresaw a Europe where traditional values crumbled, where wars and chaos might follow, where people might turn to ideologies or leaders desperate to fill the void. In his words, nihilism was not a single idea but the destiny of the West. And indeed, the 20th century bore his warning out. In the vacuum left by crumbling traditions, new ideologies arose: fascism, communism, nationalism, each promising to substitute meaning. They functioned as secular religions, complete with rituals, martyrs, and sacred texts, and in their fervor they unleashed destruction on a scale the world had never seen. This too is part of nihilism's danger. When meaning collapses, humanity does not float gently into freedom. It grasps frantically for new idols, even if they are false, even if they demand blood. But nihilism is not only a political danger. It is also a personal abyss. Imagine a young person realizing, perhaps for the first time, that everything they have been taught about God, about justice, about destiny, might be human invention. The weight of that realization can be crushing. Without meaning, why get out of bed? Why strive? Why love? Why hope? For some, nihilism leads to despair, depression, even self-destruction. It is the forbidden thought that sneaks into minds at night asking, what if none of this matters? And yet, nihilism also carries a strange kind of liberation. If nothing has inherent meaning, then meaning can be created. If the universe is indifferent, then humans are free to carve their own purpose. This is why some thinkers have argued that nihilism is not an end but a beginning. Albert Camus described life as absurd, but urged us to embrace it anyway, to imagine Sisyphus happy as he pushes his rock. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that existence precedes essence, meaning that humans define themselves through choices, not through pre-written destinies. Even in the absence of cosmic meaning, there can be human meaning: love, art, kindness, creation. But these are fragile answers, and the shadow of nihilism never fully departs. The thought that nothing matters has a way of returning, especially in times of crisis. During wars, during plagues, during collapses of empires, people have asked, what is the point of it all? The answer has rarely been satisfying, and so rulers and priests have always feared this idea because it does not inspire obedience. A person who believes in eternal reward or punishment can be controlled. A person who believes in national destiny can be rallied. But a person who believes in nothing cannot be threatened, cannot be bribed, cannot be easily led. Nihilism makes rebels not by inflaming anger, but by erasing incentives. Even science, though careful to avoid philosophy, circles near nihilism. When cosmologists speak of a universe without center, without purpose, heading toward eventual heat death. They offer no comfort. When biology describes humans as products of blind evolution, not divine intention, the implication is stark. When neuroscience hints that consciousness itself may be an emergent trick of matter, the meaning of the self comes into question. Science does not preach nihilism, but it often clears away illusions that once protected against it. And yet, in the quiet spaces of modern life, many live with nihilism unspoken. They may not declare that nothing has meaning, but they live as though meaning is fragile, provisional, chosen. The sacred rituals of old are replaced with personal pursuits. The temples may be emptier, but the search for purpose continues in art, in science, in love, in small acts of kindness. This is the paradox. Nihilism is dangerous because it removes inherited meaning, but it may also force humans to create deeper, more authentic meaning. Still, the danger remains. Whole societies cannot live forever on chosen meaning alone. Nations require myths, movements require visions, communities require shared truths. Without them, cohesion dissolves, and so nihilism, left unchecked, can corrode collective life, even if individuals find personal solace. It is not by accident that every empire, every religion, every state has sought to bury this idea. Not with fire, not with censorship alone, but by drowning it in noise, distraction, and competing narratives. Nihilism is never refuted, it is only ignored. But it waits, in the silence of sleepless nights, in the moments of grief, in the collapse. Fear of certainty, the thought returns. What if none of it means anything? It is the most dangerous idea because it is the most difficult to destroy. You cannot kill it by killing its speaker. You cannot burn it by burning its texts. You cannot outlaw it by decree. It arises in the minds of humans everywhere, spontaneously, as soon as they ask too many questions. And once thought, it cannot be unthought. That is why nihilism was buried, not because it was false, but because it was too powerful. It undermines kings and priests, scientists and philosophers alike. It strips the universe bare, leaving only human beings, fragile and finite, staring into the void. And yet, perhaps in that void, there is a different kind of truth. Perhaps the absence of inherent meaning is itself the space where freedom is born. But whether liberating or devastating, the idea remains dangerous. For civilizations require belief, and nihilism erases belief. It is the idea that unravels all others. And so, as we stand on the edge of this abyss, we prepare for the final question, the last forbidden thought that arises when all meaning is stripped away, the most dangerous idea humanity ever conceived, and why it was buried. There comes a point after wandering through centuries of dangerous ideas where one realizes that each was not a destination, but a doorway, a threshold into still deeper uncertainty, and that behind them all there waits a single thought, an idea so immense, so destabilizing, that even whispering it feels like a betrayal of every story humanity has ever told itself. This is the thought that there is no ultimate foundation, no final truth, no bedrock beneath the shifting sands of existence. It is the suspicion that meaning itself is an illusion, that every system, religious, political, moral, economic, scientific, is not a revelation from some eternal order, but a fragile construction, temporary scaffolding built by human minds, desperate to steady themselves against the abyss. If nihilism is the recognition that nothing has inherent meaning, then the final forbidden thought is the realization that even our rebellion against meaninglessness is only another mask, another invention, another story. To see this clearly is to feel the floor give way beneath everything. For thousands of years, humanity has lived by frameworks, gods who decree, laws that endure, truths that command obedience. But what if there are no gods, no laws, no truths, only patterns we invent, uphold, and eventually abandon? What if reality itself is indifferent to all our striving, our suffering, our hope? The danger of this idea lies not merely in despair, though despair is certainly one of its shadows. The greater danger is its power to dissolve. It does not fight against religions or nations. It does not argue with philosophies or sciences. It renders them transparent, reveals them as contingent temporary arrangements. To believe that nothing is ultimately real except what we say is real is to unfasten every anchor. Morality becomes preference, politics becomes performance, even love becomes a fleeting negotiation of chemicals and needs. For some, this thought is unbearable. Civilizations are built upon shared illusions, and when those illusions crack, chaos follows. The fall of empires, the collapse of faiths, the breakdown of orders, all echo this final suspicion that what once seemed eternal was never more than fragile agreement. The gods that once thundered across Olympus are now museum curiosities. The laws that once ruled Rome are dust, the certainties of medieval Christendom dissolved into schisms, reformations, and wars. Each collapse is a reminder that what feels absolute is always provisional. And if even the strongest structures crumble, what stands immune? Perhaps nothing. Yet there is also liberation here, though it is liberation edged with terror. If there is no ultimate meaning, then there is also no ultimate constraint. Human beings are not bound by fate, by divine decree, or by immutable essence. We are, in a sense, free to make, to imagine, to choose. But such freedom is dizzying. Most people do not want such freedom. They crave certainty. They cling to systems. They ask for commandments. The philosopher Nietzsche warned of this in his parable of the death of God. The recognition that the old order has collapsed and the new one is not yet built. Humanity, in such moments, becomes unmoored, wandering in vast emptiness, vulnerable to extremism, nihilism, or tyranny. For when old meanings vanish, new ones rush in, sometimes monstrous, sometimes redemptive. The 20th century is testament enough. In the vacuum left by fading religions and monarchies, new ideologies rose: fascism, communism, nationalism, each claiming to offer meaning, each demanding obedience, each costing millions of lives. The final forbidden thought is dangerous because it exposes this cycle. It shows that every claim to absolute truth is only temporary, that every salvation is only another story. The danger, then, is not only in despair but in cynicism. If nothing matters, why resist, why love, why create? A person who embraces this suspicion without care can become hollow, drifting, consumed by apathy. Civilizations, too, can rot this way when corruption spreads, when belief evaporates, when the citizens no longer believe in the promises that once bound them. But here lies the paradox. While the thought corrodes, it also clears. It strips away falsehoods, illusions, tyrannies, disguised as truths. It leaves bare the raw fact of existence, which may be meaningless but is undeniably ours. In the silence after the collapse, in the ruins of certainty, one may hear something faint but persistent. The possibility of choosing, of creating, of shaping meaning not because it is given, but because we will it. This, perhaps, is why the thought is forbidden. Not simply because it terrifies, but because it empowers. If meaning is not handed down, then kings, priests, rulers, ideologues all lose their final justification. They cannot claim divine right, eternal truth, or inevitable destiny. They can only claim power, and power naked is fragile. The realization that meaning is constructed is the most dangerous weapon the human mind can wield, because it can topple empires as surely as cannons, and unmask tyrants more thoroughly than revolutions. But like all weapons, it can wound its wielder. For some, the burden of constructing meaning anew is too heavy, the abyss too vast, the silence too deep. They collapse or retreat into comforting illusions. For others, however, this thought is not an end but a beginning. They become creators, artists, rebels, visionaries who dare to shape worlds, not because they believe those worlds are eternal, but because they accept their impermanence. In this way, the final forbidden idea is not simply nihilism, but something beyond it. A recognition of the void, followed by the courage, or folly, to dance upon its edge. It is dangerous because it offers no guarantees. It cannot promise salvation, cannot assure justice, cannot comfort with immortality. It can only say there is nothing beneath, so what will you build? And that question, whispered in the silence of midnight, is the one that shakes every certainty to its core, for it makes us responsible, utterly and terrifyingly responsible, for the meanings we live by. No God, no fate, no eternal order will rescue us from that responsibility. Perhaps this is why most societies have hidden from the thought, burying it under rituals, myths, laws, and ideologies. Perhaps this is why philosophers who voiced it were exiled, silenced, or condemned. For what ruler would tolerate a citizen? Who believes that law is only a story? What priest would bless a parishioner who sees the divine as a fiction? What general would trust a soldier who no longer believes in the cause? And yet, despite suppression, the thought persists. It returns in every age, in every culture, whispered in poetry, hinted in art, embedded in philosophy. It is the shadow that follows every dogma, the whisper behind every creed. What if this too is only a tale? And so, as we arrive at the end of this journey through dangerous ideas, it is fitting that we stand before this final one, not because it is the end of thought, but because it is the horizon of thought. Beyond it lies not certainty but possibility, not answers but questions. The forbidden idea that nothing has inherent meaning is not merely destructive, it is creative. It is the abyss into which we may fall, but also the blank page upon which we may write. Its danger is its truth that all meaning is human meaning, that the universe itself may be silent, but we are not. And in that silence, we decide whether to curse or to sing. We have traveled slowly, almost dreamlike, through a gallery of ideas once considered forbidden, each one dangerous not because it wielded a sword or fired a cannon, but because it touched the fragile architecture of belief upon which civilizations stand. We began with ancient whispers, the notion that the earth was not the center of the cosmos, that the stars were not lanterns hung by gods, but distant suns burning in a vast, indifferent night. We walked among those who dared to measure the heavens, who asked questions about atoms, who suspected that life was not breathed into clay by a divine hand, but shaped by slow, blind processes of evolution. Each idea was a tremor, a fracture in the great wall of certainty. Then came the dreamers of machines who imagined that thought itself might be imitated, that mind could be made in metal, that humans were not unique vessels of intelligence. We lingered in the abyss of infinity, where Giordano Bruno was burned for daring to imagine countless worlds beyond our own. We descended into the secret chambers of the psyche, where Freud and Jung revealed that the gods we worship might dwell. Within us, not above us, shadows and archetypes projected outward. We passed through politics, where the most unsettling idea was not monarchy nor even democracy, but the radical suggestion that no one has the right to rule another, that power itself might be illegitimate. We considered money, trade, and value, the invisible scaffolding upon which empires rise and fall, realizing that even the coins in our pockets are nothing more than agreed-upon fictions. We touched the cold edge of nihilism, the suspicion that nothing has meaning, and finally, we arrived at the last forbidden thought, that meaning itself is never given, only made, and therefore always fragile, always provisional, always at risk of collapse. What then are we to do with this journey? For some, these ideas will feel corrosive, stripping away hope, faith, or certainty. They may seem like darkness, pulling the soul toward despair. And yet, if we look carefully, there is another truth hidden within them, softer, quieter, but no less profound. Dangerous ideas are not only destructive, they are also creative. To say the earth is not the center is also to say that the universe is vast and filled with possibilities. To say that life is not ordained is also to say that it evolves, adapts, creates endless forms. To say that the mind is not a sealed fortress is also to admit that dreams, symbols, and stories are wells of endless imagination. Even nihilism, in its bleakest form, is a clearing, a demolition of old lies that makes space for new constructions. If there is no meaning, then we are free to build meaning. If there is no eternal law, then we are free to choose how to live. History reminds us that every dangerous idea, once condemned, eventually becomes ordinary. The earth orbits the sun. Machines think and calculate. Psychology is a science taught in schools. Democracies rise. Anarchist experiments flicker. Currencies collapse and reform. Philosophies shift, but always the ideas endure. What was once unthinkable becomes a textbook chapter. What was once heresy becomes heritage. And so perhaps the real danger is not in the idea itself, but in our fear of it. Fear makes us burn books, silence voices, imprison thinkers, condemn heretics. Fear makes us cling to illusions long after they have cracked. Fear is what turns possibility into threat. But when fear is set aside, even briefly, dangerous ideas reveal themselves not as monsters, but as guides, leading us to wider horizons, deeper reflections, richer lives. And here at the end we must ask ourselves, what do we do with the final forbidden thought? To recognize that meaning is not given but made is to stand on the edge of an abyss. But an abyss can be a grave or a cradle. If nothing is fixed, then everything is possible. If there is no eternal order, then our task is not obedience but creation. This is both the heaviest burden and the greatest gift, for it means that every day we live, every choice we make, every story we tell, is not written in stone but drawn in sand. It can be washed away, but it can also be written again differently, more beautifully, more justly. The universe may be silent, but we are not, and in that silence our voices matter all the more. So let this journey close not with despair, but with a kind of quiet courage, the courage to hold ideas lightly, knowing they may crumble, the courage to question even what feels certain, the courage to face the void, not with fear but with imagination. Dangerous ideas will always exist because they are not the inventions of rebels or heretics alone. They are the inevitable flowering of human curiosity. To forbid them is to forbid ourselves. To fear them is to fear our own reflection. Better perhaps to let them whisper, to listen, to wrestle, to dream. For in the end, what is most dangerous is not the thought itself, but the refusal to think. And so we leave the long corridor of history, the procession of heresies and revelations, carrying with us the awareness that every age has its forbidden questions, every culture its untouchable truths, every generation its rebels. We are part of that same story, whether we admit it or not. Perhaps one day our own certainties will seem fragile, our own truths will be broken, our own systems will fall. Perhaps one day the dangerous ideas of tomorrow will make us the frightened guardians of yesterday. And when that time comes, may we remember what we have learned here, that dangerous ideas are not the end of the world, but the beginning of new ones. In the hush of this conclusion, let us leave a single thought behind, that to live is to navigate, the fragile dance between meaning and emptiness, between illusion and creation, between despair and possibility. And though the universe offers no guarantees, no final answers, no eternal anchor, still the human voice continues, telling stories, making patterns, creating worlds. Dangerous ideas are not the enemy of sleep, but its companions, drifting like constellations across the night of the mind. And as we close our eyes, as the day itself dissolves into silence, we may find comfort, not in certainty, but in wonder. For if nothing is fixed, then everything remains possible. And in that possibility lies the quiet, infinite beauty of being human.